Coming up next, The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy. Every Thursday from 4 p.m, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
People are struggling to have conversations and connect with others that they don't completely agree with on every topic. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that we need to try and solve, is how after all this division and after all this separation do we end up bringing people together again, and what does unity really look like?
New Zealand faces some pretty big issues. First one is COVID and the aftermath. There's no getting away from that. Second is racial division. It's been ginned up and it's dangerous. Another issue that maybe people haven't got their head around yet is digital currency. What form does that take? Is it programmable? Will it be used to manipulate behaviour and patterns of behaviour? Those questions need to be asked and answered.
How can you have fair, open, democratic government by people who are appointed? It's a ridiculous idea. And if that idea is taken to its zenith, then this country is in real trouble, because democracy, one person, one vote, where every vote is of equal value, has got to be the foundation of a modern New Zealand.
What's true, what's not true, how our kids are to be educated. And, I have a great fear for the future. I think we know from history where this could end up.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Welcome to The Crunch on Reality Check Radio. I'm your host, Cam Slater, and this is the place we crunch the political issues and cut through the politicians' spin. Today I'm going to look into the Maori Party and their increasingly vocal belligerence over the treaty and their desire to usurp our democracy. And I'm also going to do something a little different. Now, sometimes listeners send in amazingly detailed emails and they really are too long for the mailbag. And a couple of those emails really piqued my interest. So I thought we'd have a pseudo talkback session with a couple of listeners who have fascinating insights to share. First up, I'll have a chat with Danny Sims about some of his observations on politics, coups and Fiji. And then I'll chat with Kathryn Ennis-Carter, who's been on Paul Brennan's show before, about an email she sent me concerning housing and treaty issues and the impact of poor policy making by politicians. Naturally, we'll hear from Cam's buddies, and this week we'll see what they have to say about the scallywags in the Maori Party getting increasingly shrill about undermining our democracy to the point of using violent imagery and dialogue. And of course, we'll have a mailbag to get your feedback too. Don't forget to send comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. Today, I'm going to tackle a troubling trend that threatens the very fabric of our democracy, and that is the increasing toxicity and disinformation in New Zealand's political discourse, particularly concerning ethnicity, race, and racism. I have a growing concern. Toxicity and dishonesty are becoming disturbingly prevalent in our political landscape. These elements erode democracy, undermine social cohesion, and degrade the integrity of our political system. Alarmingly, the culprits are not just anonymous online trolls, but they're elected politicians, political parties, and even government agencies. So who are these key offenders? Well, amongst the worst offenders are Te Pāti Māori and their allies. Their tactics involve ethnic slurs and identity attacks, coupled with evidence-free claims designed to incite outrage. This behaviour is not only divisive, but is also deeply damaging to our national discourse. Now consider the recent abuse directed at the Minister for Children, Karen Shaw, over her efforts to repeal Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act. This section is meant to uphold the Treaty of Waitangi principles in dealing with Maori children, and has led to unintended consequences. Shaw argues that it sometimes prioritises ethnicity over child's welfare, leading to reverse uplifts, and Shaw's stance has made her a target. Labour's Willow Jean Prime accused her of being a sellout, and Te Pāti Māori launched a vicious social media attack claiming she was disconnected from her Maori roots due to her upbringing. But despite the personal nature of these attacks, Shaw has responded with dignity, emphasising the importance of stability, love and safety in a child's home over racial considerations. But how about political and media dynamics in all of this? The response from politicians and the media to such attacks reveals a troubling double standard. While right-wing parties face harsh scrutiny for their statements, Te Pāti Māori often escapes similar accountability. Heather du Plessis-Allen in her Herald column has called for an end to these double standards, urging the media to hold all parties to the same standard of scrutiny. Te Pāti Māori has escalated their rhetoric, with MPs like Mariamino Kapakingi accusing the government of exterminating Maori and engaging in systematic genocide. Such extreme language, defended as an expression of feelings rather than facts, aims to grab attention, but risks inflaming tensions further. As we look ahead to the introduction of the Treaty Principles Bill, it is crucial that we foster a more nuanced and good faith debate on issues of ethnicity, race, and the Treaty of Waitangi. Discourse must be grounded in respect, truth, and a genuine commitment to addressing real problems without resorting to inflammatory and divisive rhetoric. In Fiji, that kind of discourse is called talanoa. In conclusion, New Zealand's democracy is at a crossroads. We must stand against the rising tide of toxicity and disinformation, holding all political actors accountable for their words and their actions. And only through respectful and honest dialogue can we hope to build a society that truly upholds the values of democracy, justice, and unity. Stay tuned, though, for a more in-depth discussion on the issues that matter. And until next time, keep questioning, keep engaging, and keep striving for a better New Zealand. Danny Sims wrote to me all about his observations in Fiji over several years, and it was a very interesting perspective. And I thought, hey, you know what? Let's get Danny on the show and share it with you all. Danny's on the line now, and he joins me. Welcome to The Crunch, Danny.
Thank you, Cam. Glad to be here.
So you wrote me a letter, and it was about cruising in your yacht in Fiji in the winters following Bainimarama's takeover.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about that.
Yeah, well, it was an interesting time. I was stuck in Fiji this particular year, 2012, when I had some trouble on my yacht, and we had to get some repairs done at Vunda Point by an outfit called Baobab Marine. They did a great job for me, but in that time, I got to know the local people quite well. I mixed with them, mingled with them, and we had a lot of conversations. So, it was fairly front of mind stuff with Bainimarama in those days. And the New Zealand media and the Australian media and the respective governments were vilifying him and calling him all sorts of nasty names. And so I was interested to find out what the locals thought of him. And all I know is what they told me. I'm not I have made no opinions of my own. I didn't try to concoct anything. I just listened to these people, and I've sort of got a bit of a outline of what went on.
Yeah, well, so this is in 2006, 2007, you were up there?
No, the Bainimarama took over in 2006. We were up there one of the times. We'd been there before, but the time where I got all this information was 2012.
Oh, right. So quite a few years later and before the 2014 election. So people had had a good chance to have a look at Frank Bainimarama and see what they thought.
Yeah. Yeah. There were some really important things that he did, and it's Well, for a start, the government of the day was going to pass some legislation which was very along the lines of our Foreshore and Seabed Act in New Zealand.
That was far worse than that, though.
Which was going to give one group a lot more advantages than another group. And the population of Fiji is split around about 50-50, it was then, of ethnic Fijians and the Indian population who are descended from those who were brought in as indentured labourers during the British rule in India, and a variety of other immigrants. So it's just about a 50-50 split. And this legislation was going to give the ethnic Fijians considerable advantage over the others. And anyway, the way the story was told to me was that Bainimarama was in Parliament, and he said to the Prime Minister, if you pass this legislation, I'm taking over tomorrow. One of his aides leaned over to him and whispered in his ear, tomorrow is the annual rugby match between the police and the army.
Yep.
And without any hesitation, Bainimarama looked up and said, if you do this, I'm taking it over on Monday.
Yeah, that's one of the most popular rugby matches in Fiji, the army versus police. The other one is the schools final, which I actually went to the rugby with Frank Bainimarama to watch one of those schoolboy games, and I've never seen a more brutal game of rugby in my life.
That'll be right. The Fijians live for rugby. They're just absolutely nuts on it, even more so than us.
Yeah, but you're quite right, because Lysenia Ngarase was in power and he was utterly corrupt. And this is the problem, the perennial problem that they have in Fiji is corruption. But Ngarase's proposal was to basically confiscate private land and then give it to Itaukai.
Yeah.
And of course, it was all coastal land that we were talking about. Now, naturally, that affects all of the resorts. It affects all of the hotels. They're all on the coast. There's nothing in the highlands that's remotely valuable or anything like that. It was all designed there to depossess people who owned property on the foreshore and then to take that into Itaukai control. And you're absolutely right. Frank Bainimarama did say to Ngarase, if you do that, I'm going to take over. And Ngarase, of course, did do that. And we saw the 2006 coup, which removed him from power. But the interesting thing is he also, once he took over, is he effectively cancelled the Great Council of Chiefs.
Yeah, but I'd like to run through the stuff that I've actually made some notes.
Yeah.
So there are a number of things that he did that I think were worth me just running through. This is what the people told me. He sacked the judiciary because they were corrupt.
Yeah.
And the New Zealand and Australian governments and press shrieked, evil man, he sacked the judiciary. He sacked them because they were corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
He set up a commission to write a new constitution. And he told them, you'll give me one man, one vote, all equal, or I will sack you.
Yep.
So they didn't, so he sacked them. So he set up another commission, and he told them again, you will give me a constitution with one man, one vote, all equal, or I will sack you. And they didn't give him equal, so he sacked them. And of course, the New Zealand press and our governments went ballistic and shrieked, evil man, evil dictator, sacking his constitution committee. He set up a third one, and he told them also, one man, one vote, all equal, or I'll sack you. Well, they gave him one man, one vote in the Constitution. I've read through it, and I can find the clauses that say that. And so he didn't sack them, so they got the new Constitution.
That's right. And you mentioned about him saying, I'll take over on Monday. On the Sunday, he took the troops from Victoria Barracks for a run. And there's a video of it. You can find it on YouTube. It's highly amusing. There's Frank Bainimarama jogging with his troops through the streets of Suva from Victoria Barracks and sort of down along the waterfront and up through the main street of Suva and back again. And, of course, the media in New Zealand wrote that up as Bainimarama flexing his muscles. Well, he was, of course, doing that. But then when he did take over, we had that awful Barbara Dreaver from Radio New Zealand, who wasn't even in Fiji at the time, who did some news stories about it, about the coup, and she described it as the Fiji army under the dictator Bainimarama has put tanks on the streets of Suva. Now, that's been scrubbed from Radio New Zealand's archives. You can't find it if you try. And I think it was also on TVNZ. You can't find it. But she said it. And so consequently, Bainimarama said, well, you can't come here anymore because you don't tell the truth. And, of course, she screeched about that. But the ironic thing is there were no tanks on the streets in Suva because quite simply is the Fiji Army doesn't have any tanks. I mean, the best armoured vehicle that they've got is like a mine-proof vehicle called an MRAP. But most of them are overseas and very few of them are in Fiji.
Anyway, just going down my little list.
Sure.
Corruption was rife. It wasn't just the judiciary; it was right throughout the whole country was corruption. And we were astounded in 2012 to see signs on the side of the road saying, "If you see corruption, ring me," with Bainimarama's personal cell phone number. That's how seriously he took it. Ethnic Fijians were really exploiting the Fiji Indian population. A taxi driver told me before Bainimarama, if he had an ethnic Fijian passenger after dark, he never got paid. And similar things happened in shops. And once Bainimarama came along, there was no more trouble. And then the shops themselves used to be a little bit shonky in the way they did business. And after Bainimarama, they didn't dare because the Fiji police were quite abrupt and their jails aren't that comfortable. And Bainimarama made use of them to shake out the corruption.
Yeah, the Fiji prison service is quite interesting. If you don't have a relative who will bring you food each day, you don't get any.
Yeah.
It's very basic. The old Suva prison, which was just around the corner, in Lamy there, around the corner from the offices of the Fiji Sun, was a brutal prison, an awful place but you'd see at lunchtime about 11 o'clock people lining up and they had food and supplies for their loved ones who were in prison. And it is look, justice in Fiji is often very rough.
Yep.
I remember when some years after the original coup of Bainimarama, there was 3 sort of rapists that had escaped from Suva prison and then spent the following week marauding their way around various different suburbs of Suva. And eventually they were caught. But what the police did is they handcuffed these guys and chucked them in the back of the ute because the police will drive utes with open trays on them, chucked these guys in the back of the ute with a spare tyre that was loose and then proceeded to drive around the streets of Suva, which at that stage were pretty bad, leaving them all battered and bruised by this roaming spare tyre that kept bouncing around the place. And then they would pull up in the communities and they'd raped some grandmothers and assaulted people and all of that sort of thing. And then the police would pull up in those streets and they would get these prisoners out and handcuff them around a power pole. And then they would say to one of the locals, we just need to have a cup of tea to get your statement for what these guys did, and leave them there. And of course, everyone in the suburb would then come out and give them a hiding. And that was all before they went back to prison.
It was not a place to get into. Other things that the man did, a lot of children didn't go to school before him because they couldn't afford the school bus fare. Mm-hmm. And so he made free school buses.
Yep.
There was a hydroelectric station up in the hills above Nandi and been there for years. The village had been told if they gave the land for the scheme, they would get free power. The scheme was built, but the free power never happened over many, many years until Bainimarama took over and they got their free power. Roads were a total mess, and you just mentioned those Suva roads and those guys getting bounced around, and he fixed them. Now, I don't know where he got the money to fix them. Could have been China, could have been anywhere. But anyway, the roads were fixed. That's what the people told me. The new constitution stripped the Great Council of Chiefs of all their power.
Yep.
They ceased to function. They had considerable power over government. Under Bainimarama, that stopped. He delayed elections, and the press and governments in New Zealand and Australia shrieked dictator. And given the scope and depth of his reforms, he had no choice. He had to bed them in before an election was held. And when it was held, Bainimarama won by a colossal landslide.
Yeah. Just touching on the Great Council of Chiefs, this is the hilarious thing about the Great Council of Chiefs, right, is the New Zealand media and Australian media in particular write about Fiji all the time, and they talk about this travesty that Frank Bainimarama had disestablished by decree in March 2012, the Great Council of Chiefs. And this was awful. This was how Fiji was governed before the British came. Of course, that's not true, right? The Great Council of Chiefs was actually a colonial construction, an artifice that Sir Arthur Gordon, who was the governor of Fiji at the time in 1876, decided that he would set up this Great Council of Chiefs, and that's how they would govern the colony's Indigenous population. So it wasn't how they actually operated before the British turned it into a colony. It was a construction of the British colonial government at the time in order to give the appearance that they were controlling the Itaukai population via the Great Council of Chiefs. And of course, anybody who knows anything about Fiji is that the Ratus or the chiefs are actually just a basic title that really doesn't mean anything, because the great power in Fiji is vested in women, and the land and tribal land and the passing on of that land is via the female line of families, not through a chief or a Ratu, as they're called in Fiji. So here was this system that was put in place by the British to control the Fijians, and the New Zealand media and the Australian media always talk about this as awful. It's taking away the rights of Fijians. They were rights that were given to them by the British in the first place.
I had a very interesting occasion. We were invited to the celebration of the Independence Day, which is just quite an important event in Fiji.
Yep.
And we were invited to the Visisi village, and it was a huge honour because it's a very significant day. And we had to carefully follow all the protocols as to where we sat, where we could walk and where we could sit.
Yep.
It was a large village and would have had strong links to the Great Council of Chiefs. After the ceremony, I joined a group of elders on the porch of the house talking about a variety of things. And to be welcomed to that group was really honouring, because we'd lived in the area for so long, months, but we'd interacted with the community. We'd become a part of their community almost. And anyway, because I was aware that this village was a significant village and quite likely had pretty tight ties to the Great Council of Chiefs, I was interested in how they thought Bainimarama had gone. So I asked them, I said, well, what do you think of Bainimarama? Now, here we are 6 years into his rule. And they said, well, we were worried, and we watched him, and we have made our minds up, and we think that he's very good for Fiji.
I mean, there was an amazing transformation in the 6 years from the coup till 2012. And even in the following 2 years in 2014, when democracy was returned to Fiji. Now, I was up in Fiji in 2012, and I hadn't been there for quite some time. And I was astonished in 2012 just how run down, particularly the roads. I mean, the preferred method of transport in Fiji for those who can afford it is four-wheel drives. And there's a reason for that, because they have potholes that will swallow a small car. But what I saw in 2012 was a positiveness that was coming out of the population, and it was equal as well. The population of Itaukai that were seeing that the country improve, services were improving, those sorts of things, and the Indian population who felt they were finally getting a fair go for the amount of work and effort that they put into, basically running most of the businesses and keeping everything running. But it was astonishing to see the improvement. And I asked Frank Bainimarama how that came about, and he says, it was very simple. He said, when we took over in the coup in 2006, and you have to remember too that coups in Fiji are rather gentlemanly the way they do them. The exception, of course, was George Speight's coup in 2000. But they generally don't have any ammunition in their rifles. They block about 3 or 4 streets. They take control of the bridge at Lamy and on the other side of Suva, and control entrance into and out of Suva. And the government sector is a small little area, and they basically take control of that and then say, right, now we've changed our government. But Bainimarama said what they did is they found that all of the councils in all of the cities and towns around Fiji were kind of ineffective. They didn't even do the basics right. They didn't clear away rubbish. They didn't make sure the water worked. They didn't clear drains. They didn't do all the things that a council should be doing. So what he did is he said, right, well, this town here, that's got, 5,000 people, we'll put a captain in charge of that. And this town here, that's got 10,000 people, we'll put a major in charge of that. So he sacked all the councils, put in the army with the troops of the captain or the major or whatever, and then set about making sure that the councils worked. And of course, everybody was happy with this because the rubbish was being collected, the water was working, and the essential services that had been run down and dilapidated were suddenly being fixed by these strapping, burly soldiers that were not brooking any nonsense at the same time. And the same thing happened in Law and Order. He put the army in charge of the police department, and they set about knocking a few people on the head and sorting out the crime problem. And you ask anybody in Fiji what it's like during a coup, and they say, oh, it's great, there's no crime. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, my overriding thoughts of this thing that I just read out to you and sort of described was why on earth New Zealand and Australia and the governments and press were shrieking at him, because he's doing what needed to be done. And in New Zealand, we were going the other way, and we have gone the other way, and we are now in a fairly dire situation because we haven't followed that sort of pattern.
Oh, absolutely. That's the great travesty, really, of how New Zealand and Australia treated Fiji. And it's hurt the Fijians. Like the people I know up there that I talk to all the time, they talk about the betrayal of Fiji by Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Instead of assisting them to return to democracy, they decided to go to war with Frank Bainimarama. And the reasons for his coup were honourable. The reasons for his coup were to get rid of corruption. Now, it didn't was in power for a long time, and won 2 elections, and then lost the 3rd election, but only just. The Fiji First was still the major party, but a lot of things improved. Between 2012 and 2014. When I went back to Fiji after 2 years, the changes were astonishing. You had brand new shopping centres. Yeah. You had brand new roads from the airport. I don't know if you've ever flown into Nausori Airport, which is Suva's main airport. It's a very, very short runway, and the road was appalling, and people didn't like doing it. And but they improved that, and they're working on extending the runway now. So all of these things happened under Bainimarama. Again, I don't know how he paid for them, whether the Chinese paid but I asked him about that. I said, well, what about the Chinese paying for this? And he says, oh, yes, but everyone thinks that we're selling out to the Chinese. But when push comes to shove, if they get a bit stroppy, then we'll just deport them and keep what they've spent their money on.
That's the beauty of his style. There's no nonsense. He just deals with things as they have to be done. So, one of the things that I noted about the people, being among them for that time, is they at 2012 and the subsequent years I was there after that, they were proud of the country. They were proud of what they'd achieved. And one thing I noticed was when there's a disaster and all the trees fall down and roofs are ripped off and so on, they just get stuck in and fix it.
Yeah.
No, they don't wait for someone else to come and do it. They get out there with their axes and their hand saws and whatever else they need to do it, and they just deal to it. And I think they're an impressive people.
Well, you're right about that pride, especially when it comes to things like football or rugby. I was in Fiji at the time that the Fijians won the gold medal at the Olympics in the sevens. And they made $7 banknotes and issued coins as well for that victory. And it was astonishing just how many Fijians were running around trying to get hold of a $7 Fiji banknote to commemorate that. But watching that game live in the GPH in Suva, it was just amazing. And then the party afterwards, it carried on for 2 days. The pride of Fiji to win a gold medal at the Olympics was incredible, just incredible. Yeah. And Fijians are proud. Yeah, Fijians are proud of their country. And I was born in Fiji, and I'm proud of the country I was born in. And one thing that Frank Bainimarama did that was very positive, he said, anybody who was born in Fiji is a Fijian.
That was the big thing.
Yeah. There's no more Itaukai, there's no more Indian, there's no more Vulangi, there's no more of this nonsense. If you're born in Fiji, you are a Fijian by birth. Yep. It is your right to be called a Fijian. And
from his constitution, declare that we are all Fijians united by common and equal citizenry.
Yeah, Now, wouldn't that be wonderful if we saw that in New Zealand?
Well, that's as I said, even way back then when things weren't as bad as they are in New Zealand now, but we could see the seeds were being sown. I thought to myself, this guy's doing what we need.
He is, but like all politicians, the wheels fell off a bit towards the end with Frank Bainimarama. I mean, I got on really well with him. I even had a game of touch rugby with him and his bodyguards one day. I was driving past the USP and I saw some people playing on the football field, and I thought, oh, that's Frank Bainimarama. Oh, no, I'll park the car and get out. Well, next minute he comes over, Cam, come on, play. You play against me. And one of his bodyguards says, you got to know the rules, bro. The rules are don't tackle the boss. So we played touch rugby for an hour or so. I was absolutely knackered. And here's this guy, the Prime Minister of Fiji, running around on the field with soldiers and keeping up with them. I was knackered. But
he was a big man too. He was a big man.
Yeah, but that's how accessible he was to the people of Fiji. Now, well,
he came in and he saw what needed to be done, and he dealt to it in every area.
Exactly. If you look at his Attorney General, that's a different story altogether. Now, I got on pretty well with Ayaz Said Kayum, reasonably well. Went to a rugby match with him too. I think it was Queen Vic versus another school, and he, of course, was an old boy of Queen Vic. But he went and sat in the stand in the midst of the other people, just so that he could be seen with those people to show that there's no hard feelings. It's a football match. But unfortunately, Bainimarama came to rely more and more and more upon Ayaz Said Kayum, and unfortunately, him and his father and his brother had different designs on the economy for Fiji than perhaps what people were hoping for. Yeah. He's still got an iron grip over the Fiji First Party, and it's a terrible shame because my experience of him and interacting with him is not as pleasant as it was with Frank Bainimarama, let's say. Yeah.
We had just on a subsequent visit, there'd been a major cyclone gone through and flattened. There was one village was blown off the planet. It just disappeared from the top of the hill down into the gully, and it didn't exist anymore. And we loaded the boat up before we left New Zealand with, I thought, what do they need? They hammers and hand saws and nails and all sorts of practical stuff. So we loaded the boat up with all this stuff and took it with us. And then we hired a car and we drove around. We looked for villages that were in trouble. We stopped and handed out all this stuff. And that was, but they were really happy to receive hand saws and hammers. And that's what they need to put it back together again.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that in villages too. It doesn't take a lot of money to make a big difference in places like Fiji, particularly in the villages. But that had been used in the past by corrupt politicians, because after Bainimarama took over, he conducted an investigation into the Electoral Commission and replaced everybody in the Electoral Commission, conducted this investigation about the last election that had elected Ngarase as the Prime Minister, of which he removed him. And they found some appalling situations that had occurred during the election campaign where you had the Methodist Church that was involving itself in politics, and they were facilitating the handing out of either tractors or outboard motors, depending on where the village was located. If they were in the highlands, they got a tractor, and if they were on the coast, they got outboard engines. And the proviso was to vote for Ngarase's government. Of course, what happened is they ran out of tractors, but had plenty of outboard motors, and ended up giving outboard motors to some of these remote villages in the highlands of Fiji on Viti Levu.
Only the Methodists would do that.
Right. So that's one example. You had one electorate that had 28 registered voters in that electorate, and yet 427 votes were cast for Ngarase's party. Yeah. You had a situation where the Methodist Church was restuffing the ballot boxes. And so one of the innovations with the Fiji Electoral Office when they were created under Bainimarama was that all ballot boxes in the voting booths would be transparent. we've got cardboard ones here in New Zealand, right? And this is what cracks me up, right? We lord it over Fiji and we say, you need to do what we do because we're not corrupt. Well, I say bullshit to that.
So do I.
In Fiji, they decided what you're going to do now is we're going to have these plastic bins with a slot in it. There'll be a seal on those bins. And when the polling booth opens and the first person comes in, they can see that bin for taking the votes is empty. And the only way you can put anything into that bin is for, people to cast their vote. And this is the other thing they did. They made everybody have a voter ID card. Not like our Easy Vote card, right, which is mailed out. You actually had to apply for it and it would have a photo on it and it would have your fingerprint on it as well. And people were driving around Fiji in the 2014 election with purple fingers from the fingerprint. They were proud of being able to vote and they showed that. But also they said, well, you live in this area, so this is the polling booth that you can go to. And here's the roll for that polling booth, and no one else is allowed to vote there.
Yeah.
Right. So it tightly controlled the count. It tightly controlled the transparency of the elections. It did slow it down a little bit, but that was funny. In 2014, in that election, I was up there for it, and the count was coming in very slow. And I got a phone call and said, "Cam, can you come down to the TV station? We need you as a guest to go on TV." I said, "Oh, why do you need me?" He says, "Oh, we just need you to talk about stuff, anything, it'll do. You can talk about anything. Just get on there. We just need to keep people occupied." So I go down there and get ushered into the studio. Well, I was in the studio for 3.5 hours talking, with ad breaks, and then they just said, "No, stay here, keep going. And we're talking. And then I saw Pāti Māori come into the studio. And then they had an ad break and he came and said, "Oh, we've just about got the count sorted out. So, thanks for that. But I've just tell the people to be patient, to stay by the grog bowl and, we'll have an answer shortly." So here I was on Fijian television telling everybody who was watching the thing that, I've got a message from the Prime Minister. He says, "Stay by the grog bowl and stay calm and we'll have a result soon." And half an hour later there was. But that's how it worked in Fiji.
I just want to drop back to the beginning of what
Absolutely
Frank was facing when he did his coup. After the 2000 coup, a lot of the land leases that where the Indian farmers had the land leases for growing the sugarcane.
Yeah.
And most of those leases were lost after the 2000 coup. And I guess it hadn't improved by the time that Frank took over. But the Indian population were leaving in droves.
Yes.
And they were the people who were doing the stuff.
Yeah, most of the exodus.
He had some serious issues to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, when you had Rambuka's first 2 coups, they were very vehemently pro-Itaukai and against Indians. And you saw a mass exodus of the best and brightest from Fiji after Rambuka's 2 coups. And of course, you had Spate having his rather nasty coup and the only coup actually where shots were fired. And Frank Bainimarama during that 2000 coup was actually being hunted down by Spate's henchmen and members of the army that had mutinied. And he had actually crawled out of the Victoria barracks in a drain. And so that's why he always called, Spate, refused to name him, would say he's going to stay in prison and die there. And it's also why he also, what he called Rambuka the snake, because Rambuka was part and parcel of some of the excesses that went on under his coups. Rambuka went around and campaigned at the last election and prostrated himself before the population and apologized and said that he was wrong to have done his 2 coups in the way that he did them, and that he was going to, stick with the Constitution and do all those things. Of course, subsequently, he's gone back on all of that, and is actually acting almost like a dictator again, albeit with a 1-vote majority in the parliament. But
when I heard that he'd got back in again, I thought, "Oh, poor old Fiji, you're going back to where you were."
Well, I was willing to give. It takes a little bit of something of somebody for them to apologise for things they did in the past, and I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'd seen how the Bainimarama government had lost its way, and maybe an election was the way to sort that out. But I'm pretty sure from my talking to people up in Fiji that they actually now would fondly like Frank Bainimarama back as the Prime Minister, and let's not have Sitiveni Rambuka as the Prime Minister anymore, because he's bringing back the Great Council of Chiefs.
Yep.
He's sacked a whole lot of civil servants because they're the wrong sort of civil servant. They're not i taukai. They're either European or they're or Indian. And he's got a policy of populating all of the judges and all of the government institutions with i taukai, and there's been a real clearing out of the civil service with no improvements, of course, in service.
You must be understanding and seeing parallels in New Zealand.
Oh, absolutely. This is what staggers me is I saw under Bainimarama a refusal to engage in race-based politics.
Yep.
Everyone in the country who was born here is a Fijian.
Yep.
And that's my view on New Zealand, and it was my view being brought up in New Zealand.
Yours and mine too.
Right?
And that man was doing a really good job.
Yeah.
And all we could do was abuse him.
Yeah, and we treated him shabbily, and then we wonder why Fiji turned its back on Australia and New Zealand and decided to become a member of the non-aligned movement, which is filled with a bunch of ratbag countries like Iran and China and India and things like that. We did that, not them.
Yep.
We did it. We made them feel like second-class citizens in their own home, and we turned the Fijians against mainly Australians. Australians are not well liked in Fiji, just quietly. Kiwis are much better liked, but political Kiwis are not liked at all unless they're Winston Peters. But that's because he sits down and talks with them, practicing talanoa, respectful discourse, and not lecturing them.
Yeah.
Again, it gives me a cause to think about when John Key decided he was going to go to Fiji and fly into Suva. Well, clearly hadn't been informed. The only way that he was going to take a 757. Well, 757s can't land at Suva Airport at Narsori. So he ended up, it's too short. The runway's too short.
I know, that could have an interesting outcome.
So he went up there in a clapped out Hercules, and then he arrived at the airport and then taken to a function to welcome him to the country. Had a speech all there, and I was given a copy of Bainimarama's speech ahead of time so I could publish it on my website. And Bainimarama just gave John Key a kicking that he'll never forget about how New Zealand had been a poor friend to Fiji, that they had, we had to have the coup because we had to remove corruption, and it just listed all of the things and said, and your government opposed all of this. You didn't like all of this. And so that's where it went from there. Of course, Helen Clark hated Bainimarama. So he had a dislike for New Zealand politicians. But Winston Peters and Shane Jones, when he was the Fisheries Commissioner, they really enjoyed the confidence of the Fijians and still do.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it was a fascinating time for me to be up there, and it was quite humbling to be welcomed as I was and told the sort of stuff I was by the people really speaking their hearts to me. So it was great.
But that's the thing, Danny. That was my experience. I fondly remember the 2014 election. Now, it's funny because the 2014 election in Fiji was ahead of the New Zealand 2014 election, and I was in Fiji to cover that. And there was all these New Zealand journalists running around trying to find out where Frank was or where
the corruption was. Looking for the corruption.
No, but they were trying to interview him and do all of this. Now, I would just text him and say, hey, whereabouts are you? And he'd say, I'm at my place, come round. Right, so I was up at the Prime Minister's residence drinking kava with the Prime Minister while the New Zealand media were running around trying to find him. And they were doing stand-ups outside the pavilion that's in the park opposite the GPH, the rugby pavilion, because that's where they were told that he was going to appear once the results were known. He had no intention of appearing there once the results were known. If they had bothered, they would have found that out, but they didn't, because they stood there giving false impressions about what was going on. And that's why I got you on the show, because you actually spoke to people in Fiji. You got anecdotal evidence on how people felt.
Yeah.
You spoke to cab drivers. You spoke to people in the villages. And that's what the journalists don't actually do. Yeah. They don't do that in Fiji. They go up there with their own prejudices about Fiji, stand there and lecture the Fijians about how you should act and behave, and then wonder why they get banned from coming to Fiji. And as Bonnie Marama said to me about Barbara Dreevers, she just tells lies, so she can't come here.
No, that's very sad. And I just repeat myself to say that what I saw there looked like a blueprint for New Zealand, that we needed to sort things out. And you're just talking about the councils and how you put a captain or a major or a colonel in charge of different communities. And wouldn't that help us?
Well, it would. But I look at New Zealand and where we're heading, and after 6 years of the Ardern-Hipkins regime, race relations are a worse state than they ever have been in New Zealand.
Certainly are.
And we've got this radical Maori separatist rabble that are pushing an agenda. And, only this week they've been, promising to protest and grind the streets to a halt with their process to remove a colonialist government. Well, it's ironic that they're using a colonialist invention called the motor car to do it, but that's what they're saying they're going to do.
Not to mention the roads.
Yeah, and the thing is they're on Instagram and they're making statements. This is Rawiri Waititi's wife, who is John Tamahiri's daughter. She's on there talking about revolution, talking about usurping the government, about removing the government from power, and that they have enough power themselves to be able to take over. That's all insurrectionist and violent behaviour, and the media are cheering them on.
It used to be called treason.
Well, it used to be called treason, but that's exactly what they want to do. There's this belief that Maori before the arrival of Europeans was this nirvana-type society where everyone lived in peace and harmony and looked after the environment and everything was fantastic. Of course, the reality of the situation was there were warring tribes at each other's throat with an average age expectancy of 35, living in cold, drafty huts with mud floors.
There's a book written by one of Hongi Hika's descendants. It's called Hongi Hika, Warrior Chief. If anyone wants to dispel any false notions they have about the pre-European New Zealand, they need to read that book.
Well, I mean, Hongi Hika, a few years before the treaty was signed in 1840, took a war party down to Coromandel and took 2,000 slaves and marched them back to Ngāpuhi territory. And of course, in 1840, he was dead by 1840, but his son-in-law, Honi Hiki, signed the treaty. And in the treaty, of course, it promises the chiefs all of their possessions to be retained, which of course included slavery, the slaves that they had. But we're not allowed to say that. We're not allowed to discuss that anymore because that's not the heroic fairy tale of Maori society that we are allowed to know. They tell us something different, and we're shoved that's shoved down our throat all the time. So yeah, I think we could learn from what Frank Bainimarama did in between 2006 and 2014. Certainly having a written constitution would be helpful because we don't.
But, if we had a written constitution, how it would be written, and it would be a shocking document.
I imagine it would be an appalling document written by academics and wombles.
Yep.
That wouldn't say anything, and you could drive a truck through the gaps in it.
So very scary. So anyway, that was my experience in Fiji. It was a wonderful place to be. I enjoyed it immensely. I'm not going there now at these days because of a variety of reasons, but I certainly enjoyed it when I did go there. And it was great to be taken into the confidence of the people the way we were.
The Fijian people are very accommodating to tourists, particularly from New Zealand. And all we have to do is sit down with them and practice the Fijian or Pacific concept of talanoa, that's, having discourse with respect. And you'll find that they become your friends. Yeah. And Fiji's a wonderful place. It's the place of my birth. When I get off the plane in Suva, I actually feel, it's really strange. I get this feeling that I'm home. Yeah. Even though I've lived the majority of my life in New Zealand, Fiji is home for me. A number of my friends here in Auckland were born in Fiji at a similar time to me as well. We're all Kaivitis. And, it's a wonderful place. And I think that New Zealanders could learn from that, particularly around this concept of one person, one vote, and that everybody is, as a New Zealander, because they're born here, not for any other reason. There's no preferred race or anything like that.
There was a tourism advertisement from Fiji years ago now, and they showed the beautiful water and the palm trees and the little islands, and it said, Fiji, the way the world should be.
I remember that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's been a fascinating chat, and I'm glad that you wrote me that letter, and it's good for the listeners to actually get to have a say sometimes rather than just via an email or a letter.
Yeah. I really appreciate talking to you, Cam, is I had this information I got from the people, and it's fairly, compared with what is the consumption in New Zealand of what went on, it was so radically different. I wondered if I really had it right, but I was sure I had. And to hear you confirming it all, I've been very, very pleased to hear it all confirmed. I wasn't running down the wrong path. I actually did have it nailed.
No, you did have it nailed. That was the feeling, the overriding feeling that I picked up, when I was visiting between, 2010 and 2018 is the last time I was in Fiji. That was just before my stroke. So that was the feeling I had. It was a very positive place that was finally growing, finally stepping out of the coup culture. But sadly, the election went a different way, and they've ended up with Rambuka and his bunch of fellow travellers who are decidedly racist and I don't believe they've got the best interests of Fijians at heart.
Well, what you've told me about the replacement of the staff with ethnic Fijians rather than the people who are doing the job, it just shows that corruption is going to be rife again. It can't help it.
A classic example is the former director of, he's been suspended by the Rambuka government, Christopher Pride. He's a New Zealander. And, interestingly, Christopher Pride was on a blacklist from New Zealand because they considered him to be part of the regime of Bainimarama. And so for a number of years, he was marooned in Fiji because he couldn't even come back to his own country. But anyway, he was the director of public prosecutions. Rambuka came in. They suspended him for the high crime of being at an embassy function and having a photograph taken of him talking to the former Attorney General, Saeed Qayyum. That was his high crime to be suspended. They replaced him with a guy who cannot hold the position of Director of Public Prosecution because that's a constitutional position that's outlined in the Constitution. That person cannot have ever had any sort of professional standards complaints upheld against him. He's got numerous complaints against him from the Law Society, and yet he's the acting Director of Public Prosecutions. He's also the man that was involved in prosecuting Frank Bainimarama. So there's questions that's going to have to be taken to the Supreme Court in Fiji over the prosecution of Frank Bainimarama by a person who shouldn't have even been in the job in the first place.
I have no knowledge of what Bainimarama was convicted of or why he was convicted, but I have just an instinctive feel that it was a kangaroo court. I just don't believe that what I knew of Frank and what he did, that he could have done what they say he did.
It was a kangaroo court on trumped-up charges, not dissimilar to what's happening to Trump. But he's now in Naboro prison, ironically in the same prison as George Spate for a year. So, but I imagine there's going to be some fallout from that. We'll just have to wait and see. But Danny, it's been a pleasure having you on the show and to get your insights of what you saw in Fiji and how, just to show to listeners that impressions of people who have been there are far better than the impressions or the reckons of a media face that hasn't been there for a number of years.
All good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Danny. It was appreciated that. All too often we find our views are formed by media organisations and not from any real perspective by people on the ground or affected by events or issues. And that's why I decided to bring Danny on the show. It's great we can have people like Danny Sims on the show to highlight issues like this from a more real, even if it is anecdotal, perspective. Tell me your thoughts on what Danny had to say by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. Welcome to The Crunch, Kathryn. It's good to have you on the show for the first time.
Thank you, Cam. It's great to be talking to you and pleased to be on.
Yeah, well, you've been on with Paul Brennan a couple of times, and you sent an email after last week's political panel where I was on with Alfred Naro and Annie O'Brien. And it was a bit of a rant. And I thought, you know what, there's some very good points here. And so I thought I'd make the show this week about having guests on it of people who had written in lengthy emails about particular topics that they seem to know about. So you actually also called me a troublemaker too, didn't you?
Only in the nicest possible way.
Yeah, trouble seems to find me. Now, one of the topics that we were discussing last week was housing and the debacle that is going on inside Kāinga Ora, which is, if it was a private company, it would be flat broke and trading insolvent. And you made some points on that. So let's cover off on those things that you talked about.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that I was having a rant about in relation to both the subjects that I raised was that, you know, I've been in and around government a long time. And
I was looking at your CV and looking at your profile. I said, I can't read this. It's too long. You've got too much experience.
Well, you know, I started off as a lowly little, you know, policy analyst, operational management person, and in the public service, and you know, I was promoted to senior position. So, you know, I was a public servant for 10 years, and then I went into consulting, and I was a consultant to both central and local government for a number of years. And then I went overseas and was basically a consultant in governance and public management, mainly in the form of running large projects for some of the international agencies. But these days, you know, one of the things I'm fascinated about is that when we look at government policies, everybody looks at it from a current state perspective.
Yes.
And we never, for some reason, look back on the history. And housing is a particularly important area of our whole welfare state provision. And but nobody goes back and looks at the history of various government housing interventions and over the decades, and where have significant changes been made? What's been the result of those? What are the changing attitudes to the government being involved in public housing and the whole area of public housing? And, you know, and we need to look at the models that we've had in the past and the models that we've currently got, and do an honest assessment of what worked and why we're in the mess that we're in now. I mean, as you point out, the review report about Kāinga Ora is absolutely disastrous. You've got an underperforming, overexpending government agency, and how has everything got so out of control?
The thing is, too, is that many people believe that social housing is almost entirely provided for by the government, but that's not true. The government may be the largest landlord and the worst landlord at the same time, but the largest landlord. But the vast majority of rental housing in New Zealand is provided by the private sector.
That's right.
And people forget about that. And then you get morons, like Grant Robertson, for example, and Phil Twyford, who dream up these wonderful things that sound great. The healthy homes is an example of that. And they said, we want to have all these houses well ventilated and well heated. Well, you can't have both at the same time. It's just not possible, right?
Yes.
So they then prescribed that you had to have a heating device or a heat pump or something like that in houses. And then they made the stupidest mistake ever. They said, We think that the landlords will absorb this cost and they won't pass it on to the tenants, which is utter horseshit. I mean, to use a very blunt term, it's complete. If you're running a business and renting houses as a business, you're going to pass on your costs.
Of course you are.
And I know that I did that with my rental properties. Conveniently, just before Christmas a couple of years ago, the tenants moved out of both places. I immediately upgraded it to the Healthy Homes standard. I took the amount that I spent on that, I divided it by 52, and that was the increase in rent for both properties.
Well, there you go.
I rounded it up to the nearest $10.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Simple logic.
But, and every landlord would have done that. But then we had Labor telling people who are renters, don't worry, your rent won't go up because we've now stipulated that the landlord will have to spend $5,000 installing a heat pump. It was lunacy. And rents did go up. They went up hugely under the term of the Labor government.
Yeah. But I think, what struck me as I was reading through the report on the review that's just been done of Kāinga Ora is not only astonishment of how you can have such a poorly performing government agency and, how has that happened and what's created that mess. And secondly, that they're, even in that review report, they're actually not going back and looking at the model of housing intervention by government and looking at the whole place of the government in the housing market and the government in public housing. And basically what we've got is a model that's been a failure since about the early 1990s. And prior to that, we had a model that seemed to work reasonably well. So why can't we go back and look at that? But nobody ever does. And I think part of this is because, what's happened in government is that for some time, there's been an attitude that nobody over 45 or 50 actually knows anything of any value. The public service is staffed by people in their 20s and 30s mostly.
I don't know about you. I don't know about you, Kathryn, but people in their 20s and 30s know 3/5 of 5/8 of stuff all.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that you've got to look at because obviously the quality of people working in the public service must be questioned if you've got a completely failing government agency. And so, that's one aspect. But I think, people in government are not looking at things from, the perspective of more than about 5 years ago.
Well, I'll tell you what happens with governments, having been a student of politics since I was in nappies, really. Our electoral system forces politicians to only consider things in 3-year blocks. So what they do is they get elected and then they go hell for leather for the first year and try and get a whole lot of stuff done. In the second year, they stabilise all of the unintended consequences that happened from the first year. And in the third year, they do nothing because they don't want to upset anybody leading into the election. And so as a consequence, you only really get 1 year in 3 of actually doing something. And then once they win a second term, then they're very, very cautious about doing anything because they want to win a third term. But no one gets a fourth term.
Yes.
So as a consequence, we've got a 9-year period or a 6-year period. If you're a bad government, you get tossed out after 2 terms. That's it. But we've got a 9-year period. Now, public policy, if you pass a law today, you won't see the effects of that for at least 18 months, probably 2 years. And in something like housing, you're not going to see an effect in housing maybe for 10 years, by which time you've had a change of government.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's right. But that doesn't mean that the ability to look at history is cut off, by people in government. And, again, this is a failure of both governance and the public service because that's exactly what people in the public service should be advising ministers. They should be providing proper, thought out, well-constructed advice. But I don't think that's been happening for some time.
Decades.
Decades. But
decades. I honestly believe that, because I get asked by people who are just touching on politics for the first time. They go, well, why doesn't the minister do something about this? And I say to them, well, you don't think the minister knows anything about that, do you? Because they don't.
No. They
literally don't. They rely on their officials. And guess where their officials come from? Out of the public service. And often, and I know this is a case in the current government, you've got National Act and New Zealand First Ministers who have got people in their offices that were advising the Labour government before that.
Yes.
And so the advice that they give the minister, who actually doesn't know anything about the topic, is the same advice they gave to the Labour Party, and we wonder why we keep getting the same stuff.
Yes, well, exactly.
It's the same people, whereas in the United States, what happens is in the departments, they're not run by ministers, they're run by secretaries, right? Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. What happens in the United States when they have an election and there's a change of government is that all of those people who were advising the Secretary of Treasury or the Secretary of Defense, they all lose their jobs.
That's right.
And then they get new people in who will advise the government on the policy settings that government wants, not what the civil service wants.
Well, that's because the model of governance actually works differently. And we have the Westminster model where the ministers are basically the heads of government ministries. And below that, you've got public service, whereas in the States, the executive actually operates from the president down. So when you change the president, you change the whole executive, and they remove several layers of secretaries and assistant secretaries and assistant deputy secretaries who are basically political appointees every time there's a change in the president. So that's quite a different model, and I'm not sure whether it's actually better. We could have some quite interesting discussions about that comparison.
but you're
it's a whole other subject.
Yeah, you're a bit of an expert in governance. If you have a quick perusal of the former board of Kāinga Ora, it doesn't take you very long to realise why they're in an absolute mess. It's a whole bunch of woke, ill-qualified people who are making decisions based on hope rather than reality.
Well, while we're thinking about that, let's just not lose the point about what you were talking about before, where you have a change of government. Now we have a national government that wants to take a critical look at some of the things that have been going on in government, and they want to change some things, and they've been quite open about some of the things they want to change. But this is where I've talked with Paul Brennan on occasion in the past and spoken about the importance of the executive, because basically what this current government now will be facing is a tide of ministerial advice that will be coming from all government ministries and departments, written by public servants who've operated under the previous administration. So you'll be continuing to get all the tide of what we can call woke stuff, left of centre stuff, support to Māori and iwi staff, all that stuff. So it's going to take quite a while to change the kind of advice that they're getting, as well as to enforce a new change in the public service, because it's resisted for quite a long time in terms of that tide of advice that comes back up. And it consists of, if you think of the old Yes Minister program, it's not too bad a comparison where you've got...
It was a documentary, actually.
Exactly. And I can, provide many examples of that sort of stuff.
Oh, look, I know exactly what you're talking about. And this is why I maintain that when we have a change of government, they should call in all the heads of department from all over the country, call them all into a big meeting room, at a hotel somewhere or something like that, film it if necessary, and pick 3 of them, really senior, and just sack them cold right there. And then so you can pack your bags off your way, bye-bye, out the door. Right. And then as they leave, the door clicks closed, you say, right, now you get the idea what's going to happen if you don't play ball. And give them that shock. But right now, I mean, you take the to digress into a dysfunctional government department, another one, you'd have to say the police is pretty dysfunctional. We've got rampant crime. We've got a commissioner whose nickname is Cuddles. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know. And you've got a police minister who used to be a dog handler, and he's part of the crew. We're not going to see an improvement in the police until we get a commissioner that's actually going to do a serious job.
Yes.
But, they retain the confidence of the minister. God knows why they retain the confidence. I mean, these people are morons.
But I think that this government also, and I think it's a mistake to do one thing, which the review, the Bill English review, if we might call it that, is also doing, which is to blame everything on operational efficiencies. And in this case, I think there's justification for doing that, and we can talk about some of that. But also, I think we've got to a crunch point in New Zealand society and governance where, we need to go back to first principles and talk about what it is that we want, what kind of mandates the government has for doing various things and should be doing, and to take a very close look at what's actually been happening in governance over the last few decades. And I think, in housing, if we take housing, for example, if you start from the first principle that any government policy or action is an intervention, it's an intervention in the economy and in society. So if you're going to intervene, then you need to look, it needs to start with a thorough kind of cost, application of cost-benefit principles, which is, if you're going to intervene, then what are you going to do to intervene? Who's getting the benefit of that? And what's the benefit to the taxpayer? It seems to me that in the last few decades, we've completely gone away from that consideration of what's the benefit to the taxpayer. And, we're coming solely at it from the consideration of what the government can do to benefit certain sectors of the economy, what the government can do to benefit certain groups, and including the emphasis that's been on certain ethnic groups. But if we are going to do that, then what's the cost of that, and what's the benefit to the overall taxpayer? Because
and if you're a Labour person, they don't care about cost-benefit analysis. In their world, they just look at all government spending as good government spending, and you're seeing this argument now with the talk about tax cuts, where you see these morons in the mainstream media who say to the minister, well, how are you going to pay for the tax cuts?
Yes.
Which, if you think about it, it's just illogical, but that's the question that the media poses all the time. If you look on the Herald today or stuff, they'll be saying how the government is going to pay for its tax cuts.
Yes.
But the reality is tax cuts aren't paid for by any government. They're taking less from the taxpayer. And so what they need to be framing the question is what services are you going to cut because of the reduction in revenue that you're going to get?
Well, exactly.
But of course, it's not as simple as that, because if you reduce personal tax, give tax cuts, then those people have got more money to spend, and then that goes into the economy, which then you get GST and all the other things that flow on from that. So it's a little bit complex, but it's far too complex for a journalist who's 18 and spotty to be able to ask a question like that of a minister.
Yes, and you can also see, we know that the media is largely woke captured,
yep.
And so the questions that they ask are ridiculous. And, all the hand-wringing that's gone on recently in the media about loss of public service jobs. And, some of the claims that are being made are absolutely ridiculous. If you have an army of nanny state government employees, and then you start trying to cut back on that army, then the media immediately tries to take the government to task for all the calamity that will ensue if you just take a few hundred public servants out of the mix. We're going to have a disaster in education if we remove a few public servants in the Ministry of Education. We're going to have a massive increase in accidents if we don't have people in the Accident Compensation Commission. Some of the claims are totally ridiculous.
Well, the Taxpayers Union had a video they put out on Tuesday. It was on Twitter. I don't know if it's on other social media, but they've installed a piece of sort of living art in Parliament. And what they've done is they've got a whole lot of boxes, and each box represents 1,000 staff. And so they had a pile of boxes that represented the number of civil servants that existed in 2017. And then they had another pile of boxes, which was twice as large as the first pile of boxes. I think there was 64 boxes or something like that stacked up. And then they had a little stack of 4 boxes, and that represents the cuts that the media and the Public Service Association calls savage and brutal, right? It was 4,000 jobs out of 68,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
Very large number of boxes in these mountains. It was a good graphic display of just how we're manipulated by the mainstream media and their pals in the unions as to what, they use terms like brutal and savage and things like that. I'm looking at the numbers and I'm thinking, well, I think they can cut harder.
Yes, absolutely.
Right, swing that axe.
I do too, but I wish that the public could be more assured that the public servants who are losing their jobs are actually the ones who need to lose their jobs, who've been giving. I don't think you're going to see much attrition at the senior management or even petty management levels. It's more, if it's done on a percentage basis, and it's also left up to the ministries and departments themselves, then, to make those decisions. If you're just given a percentage, we want you to reduce your staff numbers by X or your operational expenditure by X, then the people who've been making the decisions in the past aren't likely to want their own jobs to go. So, I think if you're going to do those cuts with a view to improving performance, you have to actually look at what that performance is. But I think also that, some of the models that are in play at the moment are just not the right models for the kind of government performance that we want to see, and for the betterment of society.
Well, and I mentioned before about the Labour Party has this view that all government spending is sacred and it's all perfect and there's no waste. And so any time that a government suggests that they're going to cut some spending, then there's howls of outrage. I mean, yesterday I put something on Twitter about the tax cuts, that premise that they're not funded by the government, they're just going to have to spend less. And all these lefty fools came and attacked me on Twitter and said, what are you going to do when we have to reduce government services? Well, the government sector is twice as large as it was in the 50s. How did we get on in the 50s?
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the points that I, was having a rant about.
Yeah, about looking at history. I did the same thing about school lunches. They said, if we take away or adjust the school lunches, who will feed the kids? Well, who fed the kids in the 50s and 60s when we were at school?
Yes.
Who fed us? Oh, that's right. It was our parents that did it. Who fed the kids during the pandemic when all the schools were shut?
Well, exactly, but
who feeds them in the holidays?
But I think it's even more important to go back and look at things like, and we're talking about housing. So in the 40s and the 50s, and the 60s and the 70s, the government was able to build thousands of houses, got a lot of people into home ownership. And, if you look at that, I want to go back and look at that model and compare it to what we're doing today. Thousands of people were helped into home ownership, and people were provided rental accommodation, which was built and provided at a good standard. Now, how were we able to do that back then, but we can't build it now? We can't even build houses now. No. If you look at the horrible developments that Kāinga Ora is now doing, how did we get to the stage where we're building these horrible little houses in what are going to be in another 10 years' time, new slum lots, horrible little houses. There's nowhere for kids to play. There's hardly any room for anybody to even move. And we're buying, we're sending all our logs to China, and then we're buying metal housing containers from China to shove onto city lots. And they look like, lots of metal sheds bolted on top of each other.
They're not going to look. They're not going to look like the artist's impression that we're all told they're going to look like. And in 10 years' time, they're going to look dilapidated and awful as well. But I agree with you, and I think part of the problem is there's this willingness in New Zealand to let the government meddle in things. Right, and the government almost never meddles properly in any area. And a classic example is health and safety. Right? Can you remember, back in the day when you were going on a trip on a holiday, you come across some roadworks, you never saw a cone, right? You watched out for the truck and the digger, and there was a guy with a stop-go sign standing on the side of the road. Now there is a million cones. There's automated traffic lights. There's a whole lot of stuff holding everybody up, and lane changes and all this sort of thing under the guise of health and safety instead of common sense, and the costs of building or repairing roads have increased exponentially. We've seen that too in housing. We've seen this I call it creeping death of regulation. Right, that somebody will come up with an idea. We need a regulation for this, and so they pass a regulation. And now, all of a sudden, some things that weren't being done before in housing now have to be done to meet the regulation. And so the costs go up. And so houses get up and up and up and up in price. And commodities, have to comply with all sorts of new regulations because some womble somewhere says, well, we need to have draft-free houses. And, okay, yes. Cool, we'll have draft-free houses. And then we have an epidemic of black mold growing in houses because people don't open their windows. I can remember when I was a kid. Mum would, we'd get up in the morning and Mum would walk around the house and she would open all the windows, even in winter. Open all the windows. How many people do that now?
Yeah. And so you've not only got an epidemic of black mold in houses, but then you've got an epidemic of respiratory-related stuff because people are living in crowded and can't afford the electricity. And so they live in one room. They don't open the windows, and then you get respiratory problems associated with all of that. So a lot of those problems are lifestyle things. They're not specifically housing-related things. So, there's a lot that we could talk about in that. But if you want to look at the history of housing in New Zealand, if you want to know why we're in the current mess we're in, I think you have to go back and look at the history because, as we were just saying, in the 1950s, how come we were able to build thousands of houses for people? We were able to build dams and roads and all of it was done in New Zealand.
By New Zealanders using New Zealand resources.
Yes, by New Zealand taxpayers. But now it seems we can hardly do anything without importing everything from overseas, and including the labour to do things.
But you look at the houses that were built in the 50s and 60s, they usually had removed floors or matai flooring, or we had good quality hardwoods that were put into our properties. They're rock solid buildings.
And most of them
concrete tile roofs usually. Nothing
and
was.
Those same houses, are basically, many of them have been sold off and renovated, but they're basically solid, good quality, well-built houses. But we don't seem to be able to do it now. But I think let's go back and talk about some of the critical policy changes and shifts. So during the 1940s, after the war and even before, there was a housing shortage and need for more effort with housing. The government started that with the Labor government as far back as I think
1930s.
1930s. I think the first state house was 1937. I should say that as part of my years in public service, I did actually work in the housing sector for quite a few years, and then as a consultant I came back and I was a contracted consultant manager for Housing New Zealand on a particular project. So I have actually worked inside the government agencies associated with this. But in the 40s, the 30s and 40s, it was about building good quality rental housing. But it was also about housing for New Zealanders. So there wasn't, and I think one of the worst things that's happened over the years since is this is renaming state housing as social housing. And if you do that, you get into a whole lot of things. But back then, it was just housing for New Zealanders. And I remember my parents, who were actually, and a lot of people that I later talked to when I was working in the housing sector, people after the war were really grateful to get those houses. It wasn't a stigma to get a state house. And in fact, it was open to everybody. It was just a matter of applying.
Wasn't there a state services advance, or there was something?
Advances, yeah.
Yeah, there was advances, yeah.
Yes, it was, and that name was about how the state was helping the society to advance. Basically, that was the concept. And then, so it was about rental housing, but it was open to everybody. So there was no, you just applied if you wanted a state house. You didn't have to go through, being assessed as socially deprived. It was open to people, and lots of people were really grateful to have a good quality rental house because
which you could buy if you wanted. Yeah.
Well, that came in a bit later, and then in the 1950s, the national government at that time decided to put more emphasis on home ownership. And, that was a particular plank in our housing model, which went on for decades. And the concept of that was that home ownership was a good thing because it gave people a sense of responsibility over their property and where they were living, and it also provided for the whole societal model. And that if you had a mortgage, you took out for a 30-year term, by the time you retired, you were free of that cost, and so you didn't need quite so much money for your superannuation and retirement needs.
There was also the family benefit as well, which you could cash in, couldn't you, to apply to buy a house?
Right. So the model was that home ownership was a good thing. And I think that's right as a society. Home ownership is, to have a high level of home ownership is to have a healthy society and a healthy housing market. And then, and once again, those, so that the government provided state advances loans, and they were flat rate interest, and later that changed. And what also changed was the eligibility criteria. So then it became, and by the time we got through to the 1970s, then both the rental housing and the home ownership assistance was targeted at first home buyers and low income people. And the logic was that, people who were over a certain income level could be deemed to provide for themselves. They could go to banks and get loans, or they could get rental housing through the private sector. And the assistance was targeted at those who couldn't afford to do that. But that model, and, if I look at what was happening in housing provision in the 1970s and 1980s, it all changed in the late 1980s and 1990s, was that model worked particularly well, because what you had was people getting into rental housing if they couldn't afford it, and there was a kind of a targeted sector somewhere in the middle of the population who could be supported into home ownership. Now, the thing that did was also provided a revenue stream to government. And so the government got the return in terms of the rentals and the rental payments, and also the mortgage repayments. And that provided a considerable source of revenue for the government. So what then happened in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s, the national government decided to restructure what was then the Housing Corporation, and sell off the portfolio of Housing Corporation loans. And what happened then was that the loan portfolios were sold off to the banks, private sector banks.
Yep.
And the ideology at the time was, it started with the reforms of the Labor government back in the 1980s, and they were captured by Milton Friedman and the whole ideology of free market economics and privatisation and what have you. So the ideology at the time was that the government shouldn't be a bank and that should all go to the private sector. But what was done at the time, which I think has proved to me the most horrible policy decision over many decades, was that the accommodation supplement was brought in. And that did all kinds of things, because then, in the 80s, amongst people who were working in the housing sector, we used to talk about how the presence of the government housing agency in the overall housing market, we didn't really know what the effect of that was. And so in the 1990s, there were various experiments to try and find that out and to move the emphasis to the private sector. And so then what happened is the accommodation supplement came in. And so basically you're transferring a huge amount of government subsidy from home ownership to the rental sector. And you're basically then, in those decades since, we're propping up, the taxpayer is propping up the private rental sector. And all that subsidy is going, it's not produced, it's completely dead money. It's not providing any benefit to the taxpayer at all, except those who are involved in private rental management, property management. And whether that's, that's a very deliberate policy choice. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to create a population which is in home ownership mainly, or do you want a population that's largely in the rental sector and living in rentals, with all the consequences that has?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the way I look at it. If you don't own something, you won't treat it as well.
Absolutely.
Right? So it goes for everything. It goes for, if you rent a car, you'll thrash the hell out of that car because it's not yours.
Yes.
And you don't have to cover the cost of the of the expenses and, hey, I've paid for it anyway, it's rented, so I'll do it. You rent a camper van, you're going to treat it improperly. Everything that you rent, you treat less well than if you owned it.
Right. And I understand what, the ideology at the time was, the accommodation supplement, because we basically already had an accommodation supplement for the rental sector, but only as it related to public housing in the form of the income-related rent subsidies. So state house tenants were, paying only about 25%, or maximum of 25% of their income. So that existed before, but applied to public rental housing. So now you applied it to the private rental housing sector. Now, what happened immediately was that, yes, it encouraged a lot more private individuals and maybe companies to go into rental investments, but housing prices shot up, rent shot up because, as you say,
supplements shot up.
Yeah.
It's just a circle of death, really.
And the projections that were applied to what that accommodation supplement was going to cost at the time have been massively, hugely, monstrously exceeded by then. Now the taxpayer is paying out billions in the form of the accommodation supplement every year. And what benefit to the taxpayer overall? Absolutely nothing. It's dead money. And I looked recently, I looked at the review report, and it's clear that after Kāinga Ora was formed in 2019, there has been an effort to try and look at assisting people into home ownership. But the products that they developed to have around that and the mechanisms that they're using, would involve a tremendous amount of energy and time going into staff working on those things. And basically what they mean is that, staff funded by the taxpayer are basically working for the banks because they're doing a whole lot of the facilitation between people who want to get into home ownership and the banks to try and deal with I can talk about various options that they've had. And so you've got government staff working for the banks to set up loans where they can. And you've got government staff working for the iwi because they've had a huge investment in, I think it's called Kāinga Whenua.
Which touches on the second part of your email, the treaty debate, isn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. And this is about building on Māori land, including multiply owned Māori land. Now, when I was working in the housing sector, we started the government agency at the time. Housing Corporation was starting to look at that, and they were starting to get into early work on investment in Papakāinga housing, building on multiply owned land. Now, the facilitation, administration and staff costs around doing that are quite large. But if you're also going to fund the iwi through the massive funding that's gone in iwi development over the years, in the form of...
And under the guise of... Helen Clark started all this, really, when they started crapping on about a partnership, and then Maori had to be involved in everything. And so now you've got a duplication of resources, a duplication of government money being poured into two separate areas, no increase in service or what you get for that money, all on the premise that somehow if we just pour money into these groups, everything's going to be better with no...
Well, absolutely. And that is clear when you look at this you can look on Kāinga Ora website and you'll see the huge emphasis that's given to this Kāinga Whenua emphasis and working with iwi to build Papakainga development. Now, we started to play around with that in the late 1980s, early 90s. And when you're working with the whole legal structural and institutional arrangements relating to multiply owned land, it's quite complex. But over the decades, since the 80s, we've had huge treaty claims.
Over $4.5 billion.
And lots of money from government going into iwi development. Huge amounts of money have gone in that direction. And as a result, we've got a number of large Māori corporates around the company. And they're basically now functioning as private sector corporates. Well, if you're going to do that, then make those entities responsible for doing the work around building on multiply owned or iwi owned land. Why should government agencies still be nanny stating that right through from proposal to fruition? And in addition to that, you've also got government agencies that are involved in that. So either put that on the iwi themselves, or take the facilitation of that back to Te Pāti Māori. I don't know what they do these days except write stupid reports like, hey, pua. But if you're going to do that and you're going to involve, all the complexity of working around the Māori Land Court and registering through there and getting these developments off the ground, then put that with who benefits from it. Why should the overall taxpayer be funding that? Now, you'll see lots of blah blah, both on the Kaingaora website and also on in the review report. And there's lots of stuff about outcomes, diversity of housing, place-based approaches. It's all got tremendously complex. But I think we basically need to go back to first principles in terms of what do people need in housing. They either need some level of support to get into home ownership, or they need a good rental house. And you can't tell me that it's actually any much more complicated than that. Those are the basic needs of society. I think we need to go back to first principles and what can be done effectively, and also what is the return to the overall taxpayer.
Yeah, you're right, though. I mean, when we started state housing, there was a need, right? And the government's going to step into the market, and we're going to provide affordable, effective housing for what New Zealand society was at that time, right? Now, society's changed a little bit. We've got different, styles of families and all sorts of things like that. But that's what we need to do, is we need to have a bold government that will say, this is the level of housing that the government will provide. And it's not going to be, it's not going to be 5 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms and a 15-car garage, right? It's not going to be that. It's going to be, a 3-bedroom or 4-bedroom house, et cetera. And then set about providing that at a reasonable cost for people to rent. And then bring back that state advances maybe, or some sort of facility for that, so that people can then, if they move into their state house, they can then look at buying it. Now, there's people who are living in state houses have lived there for 40 years, on cheap rent, and then they're crying poverty. Well, they've had a much better housing outcome for them than someone who didn't get into a state house and squat there for 40 years.
Well, they're supposed to exercise security of tenure for as long as it's needed. So if you're going to do that, then you have to be able to have systems in place to assess the ongoing need. But what we've had since the 1990s, I'm actually an advocate for the government providing a level of subsidised loans. And when I look at everything that Kāinga Ora was set up to do in providing that, I mean, they're basically trying to do everything except provide the actual loan itself.
Mm.
And so when I say they're working for the banks, there's lots of they had a home ownership first loan grants, which has now been stopped. There's lots of stuff about the advisory assistance provided, first home decision tool, guide to home ownership staff, first home loans. And this is interesting because they've worked with selected banks. They've nominated a group of selected banks who will offer these first home loans and other lenders involved in that too. But these are provided at 5% deposit to selected applicants. But then Kāinga Ora is underwriting them. Well, why would you do that? When you look at the whole housing model since the 1990s, it seems to me that there's a lot of ideology that needs to be questioned about what we're actually doing. And I think, if you're going to say, well, we want clearly, I mean, it's always been an objective of national governments. And part of the problem, of course, is we've had this history of bouncing backwards and forwards between Labor and National over the years. So every time Labor comes in, they want to spend more money on social issues and social stuff. So then you get increased government expenditure on all of that. And then National comes in and wants to do less of that and wants to have more involvement of the private sector. Now, one of the things that is in this report is that I think basically what we're seeing is the national government agenda coming back into play where they want to really get out of public housing. And this has been a National Party agenda really since the early 1990s. So in the restructure of Housing Corporation and setting up Housing New Zealand just to be a landlord and selling off and doing away with the subsidised government loans for home ownership, what they were trying to do was get more people involved and get more investors involved in the private rental sector. And that agenda about getting out of public housing through the 1990s, there was a huge sell-off of state state house properties. And a lot of that, then you had stuff about slum landlords and people not maintaining those properties because they were all bought at, bargain basement prices.
But the government didn't maintain them either.
Yes, you can say that. And for that, you had to look at the operational efficiencies of managing, a whole maintenance budget. And obviously over time you've got an obsolescence issue and things become more expensive to maintain. But that's when, if you're going to have a government-funded housing agency with a rental portfolio, you've got to let them manage it efficiently. So, I'm under... when Phil Goff was minister, he was trying to get into more of that and selling off state houses in the more affluent areas.
Like Oraki and places like that.
Yeah, good prices. And then you could build more in areas where it was cheaper to build. Now, that's entirely logical. But then Helen Clark came in as minister and said, oh, no, we're not going to have that because poor people should be able to live in affluent areas just like everybody else. So they pepper potted. That's when they started pepper potting houses. Yes.
Every new subdivision that was Danny Moore is like that in Auckland, right? There's a joke in Auckland. Don't worry about moving to Danny Moore; it's coming to you. But they would do is that they would release a whole lot of sections. And Housing Corporation back then would then buy up usually a place at the end of a cul-de-sac, a couple of sections there. So the 4 houses around the end of a cul-de-sac were housing corporation houses, and then everybody else would then buy their sections, build their $800,000 house, and then wake up the next morning and there's 4 state houses that have been put at the end of their street all of a sudden.
Yeah.
It's just a recipe for disaster.
Well, this is where I talk about, the experiments that have been done over the years. And we need to go back and look at, things that have been done in the past and say, well, what worked well and what didn't. And it seems to me that the ideology of wanting to get rid of public housing and get the government out of public housing or social housing and transfer it all to the public sector. The review report that's just been done, I think it's actually a Trojan horse for getting back to what National had been trying to do in various during various national governments. And under the John Key government, they were looking at trying to transfer more public housing to community housing providers. Now, that's still very much a very strong theme. And I looked at some of that when that was being worked on as proposals. And Treasury, and I might say that, one thing that needs to be looked at is the duplication of effort over the entire public sector about housing. So at that time, under the John Key government, you had a unit in Treasury that was looking at housing. You had an MB unit that was looking at housing. You had various housing government entities from the ministry down to Housing New Zealand before Kaingaora was formed and so on. And what they were wanting to do then was basically transfer groups of state housing properties to community housing providers in the form of a suspensory loan. So basically what you did was give those properties to community housing providers and then they go, off the government asset as a physical asset, but they remain on the balance sheet,
financial asset,
as a debt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you've got these suspensory loans, and then the idea was that the community housing provider would then be responsible for the ongoing maintenance. So you got rid of the maintenance costs. And the rents would also go to the community housing provider. So then what you've got by doing that is the state, has lost the asset, although they keep it on the balance sheet as a debt.
It's a transfer of wealth to a private sector.
Yes, but there's no return to the taxpayer in doing that, except that you've got the cost of maintenance off the government budget. So if you're going to have an ideology of wanting the private sector to be more involved in housing, which is what's been being tried in various forms over the last 30 years, is, where is the best investment for government funds to go? And if you're going to do that by getting the government out of public housing, but then you're spending zillions propping up the private sector to provide that, if you're going to have private sector providers, they need to be able to do it on the basis that every other private business works, and not, with pouring billions into propping that up just so that you can say, well, we've got other providers involved.
See, that's the thing. I've always disagreed with government policy that involves a subsidy to a sector or particular hobby horse of a politician, because what a government can give in the form of subsidies, a later government can take away, and it's not a real business. And if you're propping up a sector, that sector doesn't exist by itself. It needs to find its own level of where things are at. And subsidies, as you say, it's a government intervention, right?
Yeah.
And when governments intervene in a market, they actually screw the market up. They never actually improve it. It might be a temporary improvement, but eventually the market will find its own level, and then the subsidies have either grown enormously or are no longer needed. But invariably, the subsidies have grown enormously.
Right. Well, I think the challenge for this government is, or should be, to look at those basic first principles. What does the government want to do in terms of providing assistance to the population? If you're going to intervene in the market, then you need to be very clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And I would recommend that basically, all this ballyhoo about diversity and what is needed to provide it, I think we actually need to go back to a much more egalitarian approach. And just think about, what are the simple interventions you want to
stop talking about, stop talking about whether it's a Pacifica person or a Maori person or whatever, a trans person, or stop all of that. Let's just start talking about people, right? And the need of the population.
If you want to be realistic about where government expenditure is going, you basically need to stop all of that, because it just encourages huge cost and expenditure, and the taxpayers paying for it. And so this is where I think, there needs to be this current review that's been done. For a start, it's not looked at the issue of home ownership at all. It's all about
you're right,
social housing.
You're right in that it's a Trojan horse, because this is what politicians do, right? If you're going to fix something, you have to have a problem that needs fixing. So they've done a report that says, here's the problem. And there are demonstrable problems in Kāinga Ora that need to be fixed. But the connected thinking between the solution and what the problem is hasn't been done yet.
No. And I think, we've got this legacy where traditionally it's usually been Labor governments that have embarked on, big change policy directions or, big spending of government. And then National comes in and wants to wind back some of that. But what they usually do is tinker around the edges and don't go back to first principles and saying, well, what are we actually doing here and what's the model that we want to have? So I think, currently we've got a model that's in a complete mess. It's going to continue to be a mess.
And it'll be in a mess for the foreseeable future until they address what it is they're trying to achieve. And if they probably don't even know. The National Party probably doesn't even know what they want to achieve there. And that sort of thinking is being done by David Seymour and Winston Peters.
Well, I think this is where ACT and New Zealand First needs to put more pressure on government, because they need to stop this trend where National comes in, makes a big ballyhoo about changing things and just tinkers around the edges, and it all gets worse and it all gets more expensive for the next government. And I do think that going back and looking at what models we've had in the past, where they worked, where they didn't. I mean, one thing to say about all the nonsense about partnership is that actually the model that old Housing Corporation had was in fact a partnership, if you want to call it that.
It was. You're absolutely right.
It was a partnership with the private sector, because the corporation bought land. They released sections which were then, able to be handed over to private developers. The private developers built houses.
Yep. People like Keith. That's how Keith A. Holmes got started.
Yep. All of that.
They built the best state houses. They had Fletcher's were the same. Fletcher Housing, exactly the same. He had a contract, produced 1,000 houses. Boom, there it is.
Yes, so there was a benefit to the private sector because private developers were involved in doing that. And there was a benefit to the taxpayer in that the government got a return from those subsidised loans. And I think that model needs to be looked at again. And so does all the complexity of providing basically tenancies, whether it's through the government as what remains on the government portfolio as public housing properties, or whether it's what you're doing to support the private sector. And, let's not be confused. If you're talking about community housing providers, you are talking about the private sector.
They have to.
And the way that, it's operating at the moment, if you shove thousands more properties at the community housing providers, in 10 years' time, you're going to have mess of that because, they won't be able to sustain either the maintenance costs or the social costs that come from the sector of society that you're trying to provide for. If you have, if you're going to be the housing provider of last resort, you're always going to have tenant management problems. And the interesting thing about one of the little figures that's in the review report is that actually the tenant management costs for Kāinga Ora are only about 15% of the operating expenditure, which isn't much. So actually it isn't costing all that much to maintain the tenancy management, despite all the social issues that you get with it if you're going to be the housing provider of last resort. So you have to look at that and say, well, what are the staff then doing that are involved in tenancy management? And clearly one of the things that they're doing is not chasing arrears.
Oh, was it growing from $1 million to 10 million or something like that? It was some outrageous amount of money.
Well, the operating expenses have gone from 1.5 billion in 2019 to 2.5 billion in 2023. The debt's gone to 12 billion as is forecasted to 23 billion. And there's been a huge escalation of both expenditure and debt, and meanwhile the arrears in terms of the rental payments have obviously also gone up hugely. So everything basically is a financial disaster.
It's wonky. I don't think you or I are going to solve this, and we're running up against time now. So I think take your point. We need to go back to first principles. What is it that the government is in the business of doing, and what is the benefit to the taxpayer in doing that?
Yes, and it needs to start out from an objective position, not maintaining an ideology at the start and then saying, "Well, how do we make this work?" Because what they're propping up at the moment is just incredible.
It's sort of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa with, subsidies here and props there and all sorts of things like that. But maybe we do need to actually sit down with a blank piece of paper and draw out what we want for a housing sector for the state to provide, or whatever they're going to do, and then have a plan to implement that. But I don't know if there's anybody who's got the stones to do that, because there's so many vested interests in the existing system.
Yes. And then, of course, the problem of, massive over-regulation and bureaucracy has just added hugely to the cost of everything.
Yeah.
So, these are a complex set of problems there. But I think a basic common sense approach to what is the purpose of all this government intervention? What is it achieving? I'd like to actually know, with all the emphasis that they have put on various facilitation of ownership, how many people have they actually got into private ownership in the last few years?
I doubt they'll be able to tell you.
Well,
and there's the problem. There's the problem right there. Well, Kathryn, we really are up against time now, so we could talk about this forever. Maybe we'll, when we see the next report, we'll catch up again and see if there's any solutions in that, because I understand that's what the government is doing, reviewing that in the future.
Yes, we also need to think about who's advising the government.
Oh, we do. Well, thank you very much for coming on The Crunch.
It's been interesting, Cam. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Now, do you see what I mean about getting experts on the show to share with us their insights? Isn't it far better than listening to the talking heads from other media? Kathryn provided us all with really interesting insights into housing, and she should know too, having been in the trenches inside government helping formulate policy. Now, we ran out of time to squeeze in our discussion about the treaty and the radical advancement of the Maori Renaissance, as she calls it, inside the government sector. But don't worry, that will be in next week's show. Let me know your thoughts on that interview with Kathryn by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. Now it's time for Cam's Buddies. This week, we'll find out what they think about the increasingly strident warmongering against everybody but Maori that is coming from the Maori Party. My producer has them all lined up and ready to go, so let's go now to Cam's Buddies. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Lynley. Good to have you back.
Hi, Cam. How's things?
Yeah, pretty good, apart from all the shenanigans going on with the Maori Party, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about. What do you think about all these threats and intimidation, and of course we've got the protests happening today, in the streets, blocking everybody on the motorways, all that sort of stuff, all because they don't agree with some policies that our democratically elected government have made?
Well, they've been rumbling on about this over quite a period of time. It's been a steady build-up, and I'm talking over years. I have noticed it creeping in more and more. I think the activists at the top are serious, and one of them stood up in Parliament. I don't know if it was last year or the year before, stood up in Parliament and said that they would never stop. And by 2040, they wanted complete sovereignty. So that wasn't just yesterday. And the language really says it all. And it's with the daily help of the MSM, who, of course, are funded until 2026 to promote anti-colonisation theories, stoke the fire, to promote Maori capture of the Treaty of Waitangi, and they encourage the victimhood of Maori on a daily basis, the victimhood at the hands of the so-called Pākehās. They're pushing Maori language on a daily basis more and more, until really it's difficult to even read an article. So the MSM are really hand in hand with them. I remember years ago Donald Trump was castigated for saying the mainstream media are the enemy of the people.
Yeah, well, they are.
Well, they are, and they have a huge influence on stoking violence. And, having said this, I'd like to say the Maori people I know are actually happy to stay in a westernised society and are very non-violent, but these Maori Party MPs are not. They're inciting violence all the way, and they want the takeover of Maori authority and sovereignty. That's what they want. And Waititi said, we want to be in control, total control, as a matter of fact, of our sovereignty by 2040. And he stood up in Parliament and said that, and he said, we continue to fight forever and ever and ever, and we never ceded sovereignty. So, this is fighting talk. And then we've had this person recently, Ms. Kapa Kingi, and she said, we're the only party that will fight ruthlessly for Te Iwi Maori to the death. And she wants to rewind to a time back in 1840, she said, when apparently everything was ideal.
And wonderful.
Pākehā hands would not dare touch our babies then, she said. Well, I think she's got a bit of an idealised image of that.
Well, it's heroic, really. It's just ridiculous, the situation. But you raised the point about the media. I'll give you an example. Tuesday afternoon, late afternoon, News Hub put out an article, and in the article it says, and I quote, "For those wanting to participate down south," and then gives them details about where they can go and get information about the protest. Is it an article or is it a straight-up promotion? Well, I'd suggest it's a straight-up promotion, and they're in on it.
Oh, it's absolute propaganda of the worst sort, and it's been going on for quite a while. And while it's easy to say, the money that they get has kind of tempted them to go that way, but they're that way anyway. I just don't know what on earth happened to the world, really, because they just stoke this fire of dissatisfaction, really, and then it just builds and builds and builds, and the young people in particular pick up on it, and they think they are victims, so they will get out there and fight, because when they're young, they're pretty stupid, and, just like we were silly when we were young, they're silly too. And it's not like, way back when I was sort of alongside of Maori people. It's a totally different society now. I don't think it's very good. And we've got 16% of New Zealand population are Maori, but 70% of children in care are Maori.
Well, this is what gets me, right, is they talk about 16% of the population are Maori. There is no one in New Zealand with 100% Maori DNA. There isn't. There just isn't. So the people who are saying these are my people are denying the other side, or the other sides, or the multiple sides of the DNA that exists in them, that maybe come from intermarriage or cohabitation over the years. And there's this prevalence amongst Maori activists that you have just a mere smidge of Maori DNA in you, and that just takes precedent over everything else, and that if you deny that 1/16th or 1/32nd or 1/64th or some microscopic amount of DNA that comes from Maori, that if you're denying that person that DNA or that right to their culture, it's their culture that takes precedence, not anybody else's culture. They may be, 50% Irish, or in the case of Willie Jackson, have more Jewish ancestry in his DNA than he does Maori. But he's the one telling us that he's more Maori than Karen Shaw, for example. It's just a ridiculous
but you know
construct.
Why that is. Yeah, you know why that is, though, don't you?
No, you tell me.
It's because that's a pathway to fiscal riches.
Yeah.
That's why it is. There's no other reason at all. And, what I'm going to say now is a bit inflammatory, but I don't mean it to be. I'm only talking to these militant creeps at the top. If the Maori lifestyle was so absolutely superior in every way and colonisation ruined it, why doesn't the Maori Party go back to their desired 1840, give up all colonisation trappings and live that wonderful Indigenous lifestyle? Because they're actually free to do it in New Zealand. They've got land that's been given to them. It's really suitable land. You can go and live out in the bush and give everything up and live that wonderful life. Why don't they do that?
Well, let's just analyse it. The average age expectancy of Maori before Europeans arrived here was something like 35, at best 45. Right? It's now well into the 70, 75%. So, was that great? Was that cool? They lived in squalid little huts with dirt floors. There was no wooden floors. There was no windows. There was nothing. No glass, no metal, no ability to boil water, no wheel, right? They fought with wood, clubs, wooden, edged weapons with sharpened wood, so, they wouldn't last very long. yes, of course, they had stone-type weapons and tools, but no metal or anything. And the time that they arrived in New Zealand was about the time also that the Vikings were conquering various different European nations, including a large chunk of Great Britain, all of Ireland, Iceland, all the way out exploring to Greenland and North America. And they had metal weapons and pots and, livestock and all of those sorts of things. If we're comparing apples with apples here, it's not the same, and to sit there and say, we reject colonialism, that we want to go back to the way it was, that everything was cool, is just ridiculous. Just a ridiculous construct that everything was bad. Monty Python had a skit, from Life of Brian, where they're sitting there as the People's Liberation Front of Palestine, complaining about what the Romans had ever done for us. They're saying, well, what have the Romans ever done for us? And somebody pipes in and says, well, there's the aqueducts. And this is what Maori are doing now. These Maori activists are saying, what have the British ever done for us? Well, there's roads, there's hospitals, there's schools, there's education. Most importantly, there's laws and law and order. That's what the treaty brought to New Zealand. But now they want to reject that.
Yes, it also brought something else to them, and that was a wake-up of some Maori people who caught on pretty fast that actually the colonised way of life was something quite attractive, and they learned that they did not have to stick in a tribe and live by tribalism. They could see suddenly, well, hey, I can earn something. I can actually have my own house, my very own. Now, that's pretty drastic thing compared to living in tribalism. And they got out there and they thought, well, how do I do this? Well, I have to have some money. So that's why they gravitated to quite well-paid jobs like in the freezing works and all those sort of things, and earned some money and bought a house. And then they realised they could actually raise their own family in that house, and it was a really superior lifestyle to what they had. But, these activists, they're trying to make out that the Pākehās imposed their lifestyle onto the Maori, but it was actually the other way around, as I recall.
What they're wanting is a return to tribalism and everything that's bad that goes along with that. And I think that's something that we need to oppose. And it's not racist to say, no, this is where society is now, and you fit in or go away. It's ridiculous, the situation that they're bringing to this, talk of genocide and stealing languages. No one stole their language. They just chose not to use it. You don't hear Italians complaining that Latin was stolen from them, do you? It's just ridiculous.
No, and I've had Gaelic stolen from me, so, I'm sad and flat. That's a terrible thing.
No, I know. I'm the same. I've had it stolen from me too. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, if they want to go back to that lifestyle, there's a place not that far from here, about an hour and a half away in a car, and it's called Cannibal Gorge.
We can't talk about that.
Happen?
No, we can't talk about that.
We can't talk about that, but I'm just talking about geography and the name of the place.
Yeah.
That's what it's called. So,
obviously there were some tasty morsels available there.
Oh, it's bloody terrible anyway. But look, I know that the listeners would like to hear a funny little thing again, a funny sentence.
Okay.
Wouldn't they?
Yep, just before you go, that'll be perfect.
Yeah, we've got a good one here. We've got the Maori Health Authority, which is disbanded, isn't it?
Yep.
But anyway, online they've got a Maori Health Authority funded thing called Healthline New Zealand, which is online, and they state, quote, "Our goal is to deliver the highest calibre content that provides a sense of clarity and inspires healthy actions for our readers along their health and well-being journeys. And their very first article is, "Does picking your nose increase your risk of dementia?" Now, that's the fact. This is a fact, and this rubbish is where the Maori health funding went.
Yeah, picking your nose causes dementia. All right. Okay, Lindley, thanks for a fabulous chat as usual. I'm sure we'll get lots of feedback on your comments there, and we'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Cam. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Welcome to Cam's Buddies. Paul, good to have you back.
Thank you, Cam. Good to be back.
Now, I wanted to talk to you today about the disruption that the Maori Party has caused today on Budget Day in the streets with protests going on strike, using inflammatory terms like genocide and revolution and overthrowing the government and all of those sorts of things. What your thoughts are on that?
I think that we keep forgetting it's not what can the country do for you, what can the government do for you, or what can your fellow taxpayers do for you with their taxes. It's what can you do for your country. And I think many of these people are pathetic. So if Maori want extra things in some form of racial bias so that because of the colour of their skin they should be getting an easier track to owning a home, better education, less likely to be punished if they commit a crime. What is that about? Why wouldn't we all want to work out what we can do better for the country so that the country is a better place for everyone to live in the future, rather than saying, what can the people who pay tax give us for free so that we can have our children who are born mostly out of wedlock and no fathers, what can we get the government to give them for free so that they can maintain a lifestyle of being less effective than they could be?
Well, totally. But if you look at some of the things that they're saying as well, like this clown, Rawiri Waititi, who said on Tuesday that there's been strikes in New Zealand for years, including before employment agreement processes were implemented, who said only one person gets to determine what a strike is. Strikes are controlled by legislation. You've been an employer of large numbers of staff. You can't just willy-nilly declare a strike. But what he's saying is, I want to declare a strike that I'm have more say than anybody else, and all the Maori that are out there that agree with me will all go on strike as well, and we don't care what the law is. But in the same breath, he's insisting that the treaty be honoured at the same time as he's breaching the treaty himself.
Yes, but the reason they have rules on strikes is what you want to do is have an effective message being given to people if there's a problem, but not we're not being silly as far as Maori are already. If you have a medical condition, Maori get to be ahead of other races on the waiting list. If you need to get some sort of form of vaccination, they had flu jabs for Maori if they were 55, other people if they were 60. And then they're saying in any school, if you're looking at an ERO report, they want to know, what are you doing specifically for your Maori students? But there's already tons of things that are happening in our society that are putting a special effort into making it better for Maori. But as soon as you single one group out to have special conditions, then they somehow, the slack is taken up and they become less effective. I found if you want to damage someone, give them free stuff, and then they expect it and they become useless at earning and foraging for the correct stuff.
Yeah, one of the activists. Sorry, carry on.
So I just look at them and thinking, here's these activists saying we want better homes for our children. Well, why don't you go out there and earn more money? We want better education for our children. Well, why don't you see that they go to school every day? We want less prisons. We want a population in prison that's more relevant our population ratios with the community. Well, teach your kids to have less crime. I mean, these things are cause and effect, and I still put it down to absent fathers. And so if the fathers would step up, then a whole lot of things happen better for everybody. Like in the day when I was a youngster, I didn't actually know that the Maori or Pacifica kids weren't the same as the European kids. I didn't know. People at our house used to say, "What colour are their hair?" And I say, "Oh, no, black." No. I didn't even know that they were different. I thought we were all just people and New Zealanders. And having everyone saying, "Oh, we've got to do extra for this group of people, and let's have everybody go on strike on a particular day from that race," you're thinking you're 2.5% of the vote, and you think that you can actually swing a big axe. You're swinging a toothpick, man.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's just ridiculous. I mean, you mentioned about what the government can do for people, or what they can provide. The flip side of that is what this organisation Toitu Te Tiriti, it's run by Eru Kapa King, is saying what this government is doing to Maori on a daily basis is much worse. Well, let's have a look at the Vote Maori and see how many billions of dollars that they're giving to Maori. You have to wonder what sort of do these people need to see Specsavers or something, because they're not seeing what I'm seeing.
Well, also, when people say it's unfair, you're unfairly treating Maori, why don't Maori go into business and then have other Maori go and support their business as customers, and then the Maori make all the profit, and then the Maori will then enjoy the fruits of their labour? Why is it that if a white man's in business, he has to give something to Maori, but if a Maori there's nothing preventing Maori from being the employer. There's nothing preventing Maori in New Zealand from doing all the things that they want governments to give them so that they can be equal to other races who are getting things done. Like if you look at Japanese people, they get the bomb dropped on them, they smoke like you've never seen before, they live long and prosper. And why? Because they work hard and they have family values. And so when you look at these people that are saying, we have to give this to Maori, why? Why aren't they going out and getting it for themselves? And whenever they talk about the government has to do this, what they really mean is white males who are the net contributors of tax, and one of the few groups that are, because Maori in general are net recipients, not net contributors. So what they're saying is, let's go on strike because the white people's taxpayers haven't given enough of their tax to support us yet.
Well, that's what it seems to be, isn't? That's exactly, or that is what it seems to be. That that expecting Europeans or everybody else actually to pay for a lifestyle in a world that they're rejecting with every breath that they take. Yes. I don't get it.
I say we don't support King's birthday celebration because we don't think that the European king has sovereignty over us, and so we're going to do what we're going to do, except on benefit day. On benefit day, please can we have some of the money that you've taxed the other folk other than Maori to be net gain from? And look, the Maori staff that I've had that have worked for me, the Maori bosses that I've had that have worked with me, they've been fantastic people. So the average Maori that you talk to isn't full of this nonsense. It's just somehow this elite class think that they can get into Parliament and we're going to show you because they're going to be against everything.
They're going to get into Parliament that colonialism brought to New Zealand.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
Right.
And pays their salary. I mean, when the guys work with me on the job, we laughed together, we dug holes together, we dug trenches together, we filled them in, we laid cable, we went and had a beer together afterwards because we'd done a hard day's work and had a lot of laughs. There was nothing to do with whom was who. It was to do with we're working hard, we're making money, and we're having fun. And now we've got people saying, yeah, but colonialism, look what it did to you. our Maori people have a poor diet, and as such, they live a few years shorter than the Europeans. Having said that, they live twice as long as they used to under their own steam, and then they're saying things like, our Maori people, we have to go on strike because they're not getting a fair go as far as the money that they're receiving from the government that they don't wish to honour. It's just hard to believe.
That's what Miles was saying. He's saying that what the Maori Party is doing is they're saying they want to abrogate the treaty and go back to total sovereignty of Maori in New Zealand and ignore everything that happened post-1840. He said they're the ones who are breaching the treaty, nobody else, them. I think there's some merit in that argument.
Well, I think there's a lot of merit in that argument. But also you've got a group of people that were like a Stone Age civilization that didn't even have the wheels. Now they want to use all the infrastructure to go on the roads that have been made by, who was it? The Romans, I think, invented the roads, but what did they do for mankind, as you say?
What did they ever do for us?
Yes, we want to go on those roads and cause strife and chaos when their pre-settlement or whatever culture, before the Europeans came and did a terrible job of colonising them so they could live twice as long, but they were eating one another. And that was the type of thing, and some of the natural resources of New Zealand became extinct under their watch. And so they're saying, yeah, we've got it all right. It's everybody else's fault, so we can blame you.
Yeah. And, they say enough is enough. I think most New Zealanders are sitting here looking at these clowns with their funny hats sitting in Parliament. Somebody's had a Sharpie attack them on the face, and they're saying, no, actually, we've had enough. We've had enough of this nonsense. And I think they won't get what they wish for. I think they'll get the opposite of what they wish for.
And also, if you would let's see what the budget brings. Let's just, going on strike
exactly
the same day that the budget's released today, you just look and you think, but it might have had a lot of good things in there for you. Go figure. And I think Shane Jones is actually coming to the fore, as is Winston, saying we've had enough of everybody bitching and moaning about things that aren't going right. Let's all get out and have a go. Good day's work, good day's pay, all live happily ever after.
Isn't that what that's the egalitarian society that we all want in New Zealand, where Jack's as good as his master, and we all have a fair suck of the sav, right? That's what we all want. New Zealanders are pretty fair-minded. What we're seeing here is a very, very, very small group of people who are not that eloquent, have irrational arguments, trying to tell us that they know best. Well, we're allowed in a free democracy to say, no, you don't know best, and here's why. And they don't like that. They call that racism and try and shout us down. But I know that you and myself are not ones to be told what we can and can't say.
Exactly.
All right, Paul, I better go on to Jack. Sorry.
Okay. Take care. You have a good one, and we'll talk next week.
Yeah, Jack's waiting, so I better, how cantankerous Jack can be, so I better go to him.
Indeed.
And I'll talk next week.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye for now.
Bye. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Jack. Fantastic to have you back.
Oh, thanks, Cam. Nice to hear your voice.
Wow, you were gallivanting around Australia last week, weren't you?
Oh, I was on an aviation course in Melbourne.
Oh, was it at the airport?
At Moorabbin, which is one of the 4 airports around there.
Yes, I lived in Melbourne for a couple of years, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yep.
I don't suppose you would have heard any New Zealand news about the carrying on over there by the Maori Party, etc. It would have been quite a pleasant break being in Australia and not having to listen to all that nonsense.
Well, funny enough, I still tune into Her Majesty's New Zealand Herald every day, wherever I am in the world. So I still keep up. But you think we've got problems with Australia. They got the Middle Eastern problem. You would have heard about the cake making place in Sydney that made the cupcakes featuring ISIS warriors on the top and selling them. A 3-year-old birthday party. They had the 3-year-old dressed up as an ISIS warrior, and they're dishing out all these cakes to everybody. So they've got worse problems than us.
Oh, I'm sure they do have worse problems than us, but, we've still got the same sort of problem here, not just perhaps not to the same extent. Anyway, this week what I wanted to talk about was the nonsense that the Maori Party is carrying on with strikes and holding up traffic, all protesting a budget that they haven't heard yet.
I don't know, but I think that most people are just sick to death of those Maori people in Parliament, painted face in particular. Most Maori I know are hard-working people that just want to get on with their life and have a good life. And you get cretins like him that do illegal things like inciting racism and illegal acts, and yet he gets away with it. That's what I can't understand.
Well, talking about strikes and calling on strikes, individuals to go on strike, is illegal. It's actually against the law. But they don't think the law applies to him. They insist that everybody else follows the law when it comes to making payments under the treaty. They want all of that, but when it suits them, we don't want to follow the law.
Can I ask a question? If we become a republic, does that mean that the treaty would have to go?
Well, this is the problem. Theoretically, Maori would fight having a republic because it would remove the crown.
The gravy train.
Yeah, as a party to the treaty. I won't say partner because it's not a partnership. It's as clear in both Maori and in English that Maori ceded sovereignty forever. That's what it says. And they're saying they never ceded sovereignty. Well, tough. You did.
Exactly. So I like that word, tough. Why doesn't someone get tough on these guys?
Well, because people are scared. Like Christopher Luxon's wetter than an otter's pocket, and so he doesn't want to upset anybody in case they get upset and have a haka and, bare their backside at him. He's one of those, people who wants everyone to love him, but doesn't actually have the nous to realise that not everyone will love you. And so he gets upset about it.
Well, I can tell you for one, I don't love him and never will. I mean, talk about weasel words. Tell me something he's actually done since he's got in Parliament or become the leader.
Yeah, no, I can't.
I can't think of one thing he's done.
You've actually made me lost for words, and that's a very rare thing.
Yeah, we're getting off track. Anyway, my thoughts are lock that painted face up for life. Put him in jail. Never let him out. Send a lesson to them. Shut up. Just get on. Carry on.
Yeah, do something constructive instead of always being negative Nelly. What
has he done? Tell me what he's actually done while he's being handsomely paid in Parliament. How long has he been in there, and what has he done?
Well, he wore a silly hat.
Yeah, not even a New Zealand hat. Borrowed it from Texas.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, and then he had the silly feather hat as well, remember?
Oh, what was that?
Yeah, on the opening of Parliament, he wore this, feather hat. Apparently it's a Maori thing. I've never seen it. In all the paintings of Goldie, in all of the pictures of artists, back in the day, there was never any pictures of Maori with silly hats on. Never.
If he could be magically transported back to 1839, I think the Maori would kill him. He'd be gone.
Probably. Or he'd be taken as a slave or something like that, by someone who's stronger.
Yes, exactly. I mean, don't forget, that's why they called on the British government to help them, because they were being massacred by their own people. And they said, please help us. We'll do whatever you like, but we want to join you guys because you've got some semblance of law and order.
Well, that was the entire premise of the treaty, to bring law and order to New Zealand. And in order to do that, you have to cede sovereignty. Otherwise, who's in charge? Because if they didn't cede sovereignty, who was in charge?
Exactly.
Right? Well, it wasn't Maori, was it? It was the government. So they must have ceded sovereignty.
Well, they were all fighting amongst themselves. They couldn't stop.
I'm not sure we're going to ever solve this problem, Jack, but we can sure as hell have a good fun time discussing it.
One thing to remember, though, is how I opened. Our problems aren't as bad as Australia's.
Yeah, they're different kinds of problems, aren't they?
They are. They're still problems.
Yeah, problems nonetheless. Anyway, Jack, I better go. Got another caller waiting, and we'll talk again next week.
See you later.
Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Jimmy. Good to have you back.
G'day, Cameron. You well?
Always well, mate. You know the answer to that.
Now, what do you got for me this week, mate? There's a lot been happening.
Well, Monday we had the Maori Party who put up some awful images on social media, and also an Instagram post by Rawiri Waititi's wife, and who's also John Tamahiri's daughter, where they're talking about taking control of the government, taking over the government, usurping power. The imagery had pistols and burning, and all of the Maori Party MPs who retweeted it or spread it around were putting burning emblems, emojis on their social media tweets. And of course, on Tuesday, Rawiri Waititi announced that they weren't going to have hikois, they were going to have kākois, where they were going to drive cars extremely slowly on motorways and block on-ramps and off-ramps, all for Thursday. That's what they said. They were going to do this on Thursday to protest a budget that they haven't seen or heard of. And, of course, we've got a whole bunch of these protesters out there now, have blocked roads and caused all sorts of carnage and mayhem, all because they oppose the policies of a democratically elected government. And I'm just interested what you think about that.
Well, I'm just glad their protests this morning were a flop. No one cares. All it did is piss people off. If you're going to block people trying to earn money to feed their families, you're just going to lose more support. Using guns and imagery for a political party is a massive red flag, and I cannot believe that the media won't call them out on it. ACT get called out for supporting legal, safe gun ownership. They get called out for saying they're going to get more people killed. Yet here we have a party using actual guns in slogans, and they don't get questioned about it at all. It's a disgrace. I can't believe it.
Total disgrace.
So, yeah,
a double standard.
A flop.
There's a double standard, isn't there? Absolute double standard. It's
a massive double standard, mate. And the exaggeration saying that they're trying to cancel Maoris. I mean, it's insane. JT's daughter looked unhinged.
Well, do you remember?
Mad.
Do you remember when David Seymour said that Guy Fawkes was the only person who entered Parliament with honourable intentions, right? And the media screamed, he's trying to blow up Parliament. He wants to blow up things, blah, blah, blah. Here you've got JT's daughter making unhinged statements about taking control. Enough is enough. We're not tolerating this anymore. We're going to take control of the government. We never ceded sovereignty. We're going to take our own sovereignty, and we're going to supersede all the colonialist things that are in place, and we're going to take control, and this is our country, and you can all go hang. Not a peep.
Yeah, but no one actually asked these idiots how they'd actually proposed to do it. Okay, go ahead, do what you're going to do. What you going to do? Build another government? How's she going to get the taxes? How's it actually going to work without the main government supporting it? It's insane. It's literally extremist.
I think they want colonial taxes. They love that aspect.
Of course they do. They're just a bunch of woke communists, and they're using marriedom as a vehicle, and it's terrible, to be honest. It's just
this was encouraged by.
Remember, most of the government we have at the moment is the biggest percentage of Maori we've ever had. The Deputy Prime Minister. Both
they're
Māori.
They're not the right sort of Maori, though.
And that's the problem.
Yeah.
They don't really care unless it's the type. It's impossible to satisfy these unhinged nutters. And I hope that people are watching these people, because this is going to potentially create really dangerous conditions for our country. Real divisive, ugly situation that's basically unnecessary. Because, race relations and that have been getting better for the last, 100, 200 years. And yet we seem to be going into a period where we're going backwards.
Well, they use statements like, the government is committing genocide on Maori. they're talking about the government stole our language. Well, if the government stole the language, I know one thing about governments, they're very good at archiving things. Are they suggesting there's an archive of Maori language somewhere that was stolen? I mean, this is the lunacy of their arguments, where they're using highly emotive terms and increasingly more violent terms, where they're talking about this is a revolution, pictures of guns burning things. Revolutions are never bloodless, right? Very rarely.
Wearing Che Guevara's hat.
Well, exactly. It's just insane.
I think, and both sides can admit that atrocities did take place in.
Of course they did. It's historical fact.
19th century. But it was just a thing that happened back then. It was horrendous stuff happened all over the world. Terrible. We can't reverse time. We just got to go forward together somehow. And these people aren't willing to. For a start, they won't propose a way to go forward that's not lunatic, right? So I don't know what you do about it. I have no idea why the media gives these people airtime. It's insane.
I think they're in on it. I think it's just because it's anti-government and they're anti-government, this government in particular. And I think they're just doing it because they can. But it doesn't create harmony in society as a result. It certainly isn't doing that. People will probably write in and complain that I'm being racist I'm just talking about the situation. We have a bunch of people who don't believe in democracy. Debbie Packer has said that, it's outrageous that the government is going to bring in referenda for voters to say whether yes or no, whether they want Maori wards. And that's appalling, and we need to oppose that. So we've got the co-leader of the Maori Party on record as saying she doesn't believe in democracy. And that's apparently okay.
No, she would only like democracy if she got the outcome she wanted, Kim.
Well, that's right. But they don't believe in democracy. They don't want people having a say. They don't want... No,
they're commies. They're commies. They would love to be the dictators in a communist Maori state, but it's just not going to happen. Because there's too many good, normal Māori oppose it as well. It's utter insanity. The sooner those two current co-leaders are gone, the previous Maori co-leaders, Pita and Tariana, were amazing and accepted the reality.
Yeah, Peter Sharples and Tariana Turia acted with integrity and honesty.
Big time.
I've got nothing but praise for Tariana Turia. She was part of the Labour Party. She didn't agree with Helen Clark and the foreshore and seabed legislation, so she said, well, I'm going to resign. I'm going to resign from Parliament. I'm going to hold a by-election and I'm going to win. And she did. That's a person of integrity. She didn't party hop.
Principles.
Yeah, she's got principles. I might not agree 100% with her on that, but I admire anybody who has principles and does what she says she's going to do. And she did. And she acted with integrity and honesty in all aspects of her life in Parliament. And so did Peter Sharples. That's why John Key worked with them. But this lot, you can't work with them.
No, and I think that's a good thing for the right side of the House, because whenever anyone ever votes for the Labour Party again, you're going to get the Māori Party and the Green Party with unhinged Schwabra as a side plate with them, which is a massive problem for Labour.
Total problem for Labour.
And that's why Chippy's still there, because no one else wants to lead because of this problem.
Yep.
So, to be fair, as long as they never actually get into power, imagine the carnage if they did. They'll just imagine the Greens, the Māori Party, and Labour sitting in the cabinet room trying to make.
I can imagine the carnage. It'd be just awful.
It'd be pretty funny viewing, except for the carnage for the country. But yeah, imagine the extremists sitting in cabinet.
Oh, mate, it'd be terrible. Yeah. Anyway, that's all we've got time for today, Jimmy. So thanks for your contribution, and we'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Cam. Cheers, mate.
See you, mate. Bye. If a white nationalist had said the things that the Maori Party is saying, you can be assured that the SIS and the police would be kicking in their doors. We'd also not hear the end of it from Kate Hanna and Byron Clark from the Disinformation Project. Strangely, they and the Human Rights Commission are suddenly very silent. Tell us your thoughts on Cam's Buddies by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. And now it's time for the mailbag. Some general feedback. Andy writes and says, Cam, not sure if I heard it on The Crunch or another show last week, but I think it was Winston Peters telling a joke or story about the snake taken in by a kind woman. Anyway, I was listening to my music library on shuffle and a song popped up that retold that same joke, The Snake by L. Watson. Thought you might like to play it on your show. Well, Andy, I'm going to add that to the Crunch playlist. Once we get through New Zealand Music Month, I'll have a listen to it and maybe we'll play it. Mary writes, Cameron Slater, are you going to knock Heather Duplessis right off her number one Thursday spot? Great show. Yes, Mary, that's the plan. And Jane writes, another great show, Cam, and I particularly loved this week's music choices. Now about my interview with Sandra Gowdy discussing Dr. Michael Bassett's article on the Waitangi Tribunal. Excellent show, Cam. Sandra is an inspiration. Another comment, sabotage or treason, re your comment on Labour's destruction of our economy. Linda says, Sandra Gowdy is knowledgeable and articulate. I agree the assessment of government fiscal responsibility should be independent, perhaps the Reserve Bank and a couple of economists or bank heads. If it isn't independent, then it may as well not exist. Another anonymous comment, we're one of two countries in the world that advertise drugs on TV. Great to listen to Sandra, so many sensible comments. Cam and Rachel, great interview and agree 100%. And Sam writes and says, another great show, Cam, crazy what is happening with the Waitangi Tribunal. Sandra is always good, such a straight shooter. Keep up the good work. Love the Buddy segment and especially enjoyed your music too. Good to hear the Kiwi classics. And now some comments about Michael Bassett. It was just sort of furthering Sandra's conversation on his article. Excellent chat with Michael Bassett today. Thank you, Cam. Love the music track To Follow too. And that was from Jan. Kingsley writes and says, great listening to Dr. Michael Bassett, an old lecturer of mine. Yes, that makes me old too. He was terrific as a teacher. His views on the Maori issues are on point. I'm annoyed that the Maori seats are still there, let alone the tribunal. The obscene behaviour by the Maori Party in Parliament is beyond a joke, and the silly hat party does not have a relevant mandate anyway. And the performance of the Green Party is no better, just embarrassing. Got an anonymous comment. I agree, Mr. Bassett. I, for one, as a half Maori Pākehā wahine, do not want the embarrassing elite Maori ever making decisions on the behalf of my and our whānau. I do not support Te Pāti Māori's ideology, but I do consider the great chasm between ceding or not ceding sovereignty in 1840. I expect truth will prevail. And Leona writes, I've just listened to Dr. Michael Bassett's interview on 24 May with Cam Slater. Sure, there were some relevant points made, and yes, it's frustrating to work with Maori when there is no obvious way forward nor agreement. In general, the interview reeked of informed ignorance. I suspect neither Cam nor Michael have read Dame Anne Salmon's books, nor worked with the Maori organisation at Flax Roots. Well, actually, I have read her books, and I have worked with the Maori organisation at Flax Roots. She goes on, our environment wouldn't be in this mess if Te Ao Māori was considered and enacted more than it is now. Really? What about the moa? Did you forget about the moa? Leonie says that she'll continue to support RCR as that's what it's all about, different viewpoints. And Leona, I agree with you 100% on that last point. We can both agree to disagree, and you can share your opinions and I'll share mine. Now, about Kāinga Ora, Cam's buddies. Ruth says, hi, Cam, just a comment from your chat with your buddy Jimmy. No need to feel sorry for Luxon. National was a useless party in opposition. They just seemed to accept all of Labour's crap policies and blunders. We rarely heard them bleat or raise their head above the parapet during the last 6 years, and particularly during the COVID years. Little sympathy from me. Thanks again for an interesting crunch, my favourite show. And from the 16th of May show about charter schools, we have a comment that says, on hearing your Cam's Buddy segment about schools back in the day, It reminded me about what my mum said about her art class back in the day at school. We were often told to go and draw rocks while the teacher was off having an affair with another teacher. Then both teachers' marriages split and they got married. That's interesting. And about the Waitangi Tribunal, Bruce says the Waitangi Tribunal is bankrupt in New Zealand, and he's provided a YouTube video to watch and share. And that's the mailbag for this week. That's it for The Crunch this week. It was fantastic to have listeners on the show for once, sharing their insights and observations in areas they know a great deal about. Danny provided us with his perspectives on Fiji and their politics, and he also has other areas of interest that are fascinating as well. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more from him this year. Kathryn Ennis-Carter has been on Paul Brennan's show, and she had heard me on the panel last week and emailed about housing and the treaty. I'm so glad I decided to have listeners on the show this week, and I'm very grateful for Kathryn sharing with us some of the things that are troubling her. But this is why we have Reality Check Radio. It's why we exist. It's our very reason for being, so that we can share these interesting characters with you all and have difficult discussions and not shy away from them. You can keep up with all my shows and indeed all of our shows by using the RCR app, and you can even use the app to stream live. And a big thanks to the team that put together this show and make it all work. It's been a real pleasure having you all back this week. I'm loving all your feedback and really enjoying talking to so many people, sharing their thoughts on politics, life, and everything in between. So a big shout out to all of you. Thank you for listening and having faith in me as we continue to explore this beautiful game of politics together. Don't forget to email suggestions to inbox@realitycheck.radio for people for me to interview. And let's make this show the best political show in New Zealand. Stay tuned for a repeat of Rodney Hyde's Real Talk coming up next, followed by a replay of Truth Speaker with Tobias Tahi. Finally, to finish, a song for my biggest fan on Waiheke, Always on My Mind by Tiki Tane. Look forward to having you join me again next week for The Crunch with Cam Slater.
You've been listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater. Remember, you can check out the replays for today's show on our website at www.realitycheck.radio/replays. Tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. for more with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.